Welcome back to Crime Stories for Sleep. Tonight we continue our journey through the quiet corridors of documented crime, where every incident becomes a story preserved in careful detail. Let yourself settle into the rhythm of reports being written, filed and forgotten as we explore the endless detail of police, paperwork, and the silence that fills the rooms where these stories were born. The report writing room on the third floor of the Central Precinct had witnessed thousands of stories being transformed from chaotic human experience into orderly documentation. Detective Frank Morrison sat at desk number 7, the same desk he had occupied for the past 12 years, slowly pecking out the details of a residential burglary that had occurred on Maple Street earlier that afternoon. The IBM Selectric typewriter hummed quietly as he worked, each keystroke deliberate and measured, adding to the symphony of documentation that filled the room. During the evening shift, fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in that particular shade of institutional brightness that made the work feel both important and mundane simultaneously. Around him, 6 other detectives worked at their own reports, the collective sound of typing creating a rhythm that had become as familiar as breathing. This was the hour when the day's incidents were transformed into the permanent record, when the raw material of human conflict and resolution was processed into the careful language of official documentation. Detective Morrison began with the standard format that had been established by decades of police work, each report following the same basic structure that allowed any officer to quickly understand the essential facts of any case. Case number 874429 had been assigned to the incident at 1247 Maple Street, where homeowner Margaret Delacroix had returned from her weekly grocery shopping to find her front door standing open and her living room furniture scattered across the floor. The victim's statement had been taken at 2:47 p.m., with Detective Morrison noting that Mrs. Delacroix appeared calm but shaken, speaking in the measured tones of someone working hard to maintain control over their emotions. She had provided a detailed inventory of missing items, including a television set, a small radio, several pieces of costume jewelry, and approximately $40 in cash that had been kept in a ceramic jar on the kitchen counter. Detective Morrison typed each detail with the same careful attention, understanding that these words would become the official record of Mrs. Delacroix's experience, the document that insurance companies would reference and that other officers might need to consult if similar crimes occurred in the neighborhood. The report would become part of a larger pattern of documentation that helped the department understand trends, allocate resources, and measure the effectiveness of various crime prevention strategies. The physical evidence section of the report required particular attention to detail. Detective Morrison had photographed the scene before anything was moved, documenting the condition of the front door, which showed signs of forced entry around the lock mechanism. The perpetrator had used what appeared to be a crowbar or similar tool, leaving distinctive marks in the wood that might prove useful if similar tools were found in the possession of suspects. Inside the house, the disturbance had been systematic rather than random. The intruder had moved methodically through each room, searching through drawers and closets, but leaving most items undisturbed unless they had obvious value. This pattern suggested someone familiar with residential burglary, someone who knew how to work quickly and efficiently while leaving minimal evidence behind. Detective Morrison included in his report the detailed measurements of footprints found in the soft soil outside Mrs. Delacroix's bedroom window. The prints suggested a male subject wearing size 10 work boots with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel. He had photographed these impressions from multiple angles and taken plaster casts that were now drying in the evidence room. Downstairs. The witness interview section reflected the patient work that had characterized Detective Morrison's approach to the case. He had spoken with neighbors on both sides of Mrs. Delacroix's house, as well as residents across the street who might have observed unusual activity during the time frame when the burglary occurred. Mrs. Chun from next door had been home all afternoon but had heard nothing unusual, though she noted that her television had been turned up louder than normal due to a favorite program. Mr. Sullivan from across the street had been working in his garage and had noticed a dark-colored pickup truck parked on Maple Street for approximately 20 minutes during the early afternoon. The vehicle had not belonged to anyone he recognized from the neighborhood, and he had observed a single occupant who remained in the driver's seat throughout the time the truck was parked. Mr. Sullivan had provided a partial license, plate number, and a general description of both the vehicle and its operator. These details filled several pages of Detective Morrison's report, each observation carefully documented with specific times, locations, and descriptions that might prove crucial to solving the case. The process of writing these reports required a particular kind of patience, an ability to find significance in details that might seem mundane to civilians but could provide the key insights that led to successful investigations. Detective Morrison had learned over his years of police work that the quality of the initial report often determined the likelihood of solving a case. Crimes that were documented thoroughly and accurately were far more likely to be resolved than those where important details were overlooked or inadequately recorded. The extra time spent in careful documentation almost always proved worthwhile when cases went to trial, or when patterns emerged that connected seemingly unrelated incidents. The typewriter continued its mechanical rhythm as Detective Morrison moved to the follow-up investigation section of his report. He had contacted local pawn shops with descriptions of the stolen items, though experience had taught him that professional burglars typically avoided legitimate pawn shops in favor of less traceable methods of disposing of stolen goods. Still, the formal notification created a paper trail that might prove useful if any of Mrs. Delacroix's belongings surfaced in the legitimate resale market. He had also coordinated with the patrol division to increase visibility in the Maple Street neighborhood during the evening hours when many residents would be returning from work. The presence of marked police vehicles often served as an effective deterrent to repeat crimes in the same area, while also providing reassurance to neighbors who might be feeling vulnerable after learning about the burglary. The report documented Detective Morrison's consultation with the department's crime analysis unit, which maintained comprehensive databases of criminal patterns throughout the city. The computer system, still relatively new in 1987, allowed analysts to search for similarities between current cases and historical incidents, identifying potential serial offenders or geographic clusters that might indicate organized criminal activity. Initial analysis of the Delacroix burglary had revealed similarities to 3 other residential break-ins that had occurred within a 2-mile radius over the past 6 weeks. All had involved forced entry through front doors during afternoon hours. All had targeted homes where residents were away for predictable periods, and all had involved the theft of easily portable items with immediate resale value. This pattern had led Detective Morrison to expand his investigation beyond the immediate circumstances of Mrs. Delacroix's case. He had requested surveillance reports from patrol officers who worked the day shift in the affected neighborhoods, looking for vehicles or individuals who had been observed multiple times in areas where burglary subsequently occurred. The detailed work of cross-referencing these various data sources required hours of careful analysis, most of it conducted in the quiet rooms where detectives worked with case files spread across their desks, comparing reports and looking for connections that might not be immediately obvious. This analytical work represented a significant portion of investigative police work, though it rarely received the attention that more dramatic aspects of law enforcement attracted in popular media. Detective Morrison's report included a section on preventive recommendations that he had discussed with Mrs. Delacroix during his follow-up visit to her home. These suggestions ranged from immediate security improvements, such as installing deadbolt locks and reinforcing door frames, to longer-term considerations like participating in neighborhood watch programs and coordinating with neighbors to maintain surveillance of each other's properties during predictable absence periods. The report also documented Detective Morrison's coordination with the department's crime prevention unit, which provided educational materials and conducted security assessments for residents who had been victimized by property crimes. These services were designed not only to prevent repeat victimization, but also to help crime victims regain a sense of control and security that was often disrupted by the experience of having their homes invaded. As Detective Morrison continued typing, the room around him maintained its quiet focus on the essential work of documentation. Each detective worked on their own cases, but the collective effort created a comprehensive record of the city's daily encounter with crime and its aftermath. These reports would be filed in the archives that Detective Chun had been exploring, eventually becoming part of the historical record that helped future investigators understand patterns and trends in criminal activity. At desk number 3, Detective Williams was completing a report on a domestic violence incident that had required careful attention to both the immediate safety concerns and the complex family dynamics that had contributed to the situation. Her report detailed the initial call from neighbors who had heard arguing and what sounded like furniture being thrown. The response by patrol officers who had arrived to find a situation that required both law enforcement intervention and social service support. The documentation process for domestic violence cases required particular sensitivity to the ongoing safety of victims, while also creating records that might be necessary for future legal proceedings. Detective Williams had included in her report detailed photographs of injuries sustained by the victim, documentation of property damage that had occurred during the incident, and careful records of statements made by both parties involved in the dispute. Her report also documented the complex process of connecting the victim with appropriate support services, including temporary shelter arrangements, legal advocacy resources, and counseling services that specialized in domestic violence situations. These referrals required extensive coordination with agencies outside the police department, each contact carefully documented to create a comprehensive record of the assistance that had been provided. The typewriter at desk number 3 maintained its own rhythm as Detective Williams worked through the detailed requirements of documenting a case that involved not only criminal behavior but also the social service interventions that were often necessary to prevent future incidents. Her report would become part of a larger file that might be referenced for months or years as the family worked through the legal and therapeutic processes that address the underlying causes of the violence. Across the room, Detective Rodriguez was documenting a fraud case that had required weeks of investigation to understand fully. An elderly resident, Mr. Patterson, had been contacted by phone by someone claiming to represent his bank, requesting personal information to resolve what was described as a problem with his account. The caller had been convincing enough that Mr. Patterson had provided his social security number, bank account information, and other details that had subsequently been used to withdraw money from his account and apply for credit cards in his name. The investigation had required Detective Rodriguez to work with multiple financial institutions, telephone companies, and federal agencies that had jurisdiction over interstate fraud cases. His report documented each contact, each request for information, and each piece of evidence that had been gathered in the effort to identify and prosecute the individuals responsible for the fraud. The complexity of financial crimes often required reports that were far longer and more detailed than those documenting more straightforward offenses. Detective Rodriguez's documentation included copies of bank statements, telephone records, credit applications, and other financial documents that provided the paper trail necessary to prove criminal intent and trace the movement of stolen funds. These fraud cases represented a growing category of crime that required new approaches to investigation and documentation. The increasing use of telephone and computer systems by criminals meant that police departments needed to develop expertise in areas that had not traditionally been part of law enforcement training. Detective Rodriguez had attended specialized courses in financial investigation techniques, learning how to trace electronic transactions and work with federal agencies that had resources not available to local police departments. His report included detailed descriptions of the techniques used by the fraudsters, information that would be shared with other departments and used to educate potential victims about how to protect themselves from similar schemes. The educational component of police work had become increasingly important as criminals developed more sophisticated methods that targeted vulnerable populations like elderly residents who might be less familiar with modern financial security practices. At desk number 5, Detective Thompson was completing documentation of a vandalism case that had required a different kind of investigative approach. Someone had been systematically damaging vehicles parked in the downtown business district, using sharp objects to scratch paint and puncture tires. The pattern of damage suggested personal motivation rather than random destruction, leading Detective Thompson to focus on identifying potential conflicts that might have motivated the vandalism. His report documented interviews with business owners, employees, and regular customers of establishments in the affected area, looking for anyone who might have been involved in disputes that could have escalated to property destruction. The methodical approach had eventually led to the identification of a former employee who had been terminated from one of the businesses and had been targeting vehicles belonging to people associated with his former workplace. The resolution of the case had required Detective Thompson to work with the business owner and the former employee to develop a restitution plan that addressed the property damage while also dealing with the underlying employment dispute that had motivated the vandalism. His report documented this mediation process, showing how criminal cases could sometimes be resolved through approaches that addressed root causes rather than simply punishing criminal behavior. The documentation of these alternative resolution processes required careful attention to legal requirements while also recording the community-based approaches that often proved more effective than traditional prosecution in preventing future incidents. Detective Thompson's report would serve as a model for other officers dealing with similar cases where underlying conflicts contributed to criminal behavior. As the evening progressed, the report writing room maintained its quiet rhythm of documentation and analysis. Each detective worked through their cases with the same careful attention to detail, understanding that their reports would become the permanent record of incidents that had disrupted the normal order of community life. The typewriters continued their mechanical symphony, transforming the raw experience of crime and investigation into the formal language of official documentation. The process required a particular kind of mental discipline, an ability to take complex human situations and translate them into clear, factual accounts that could be understood by prosecutors, judges, insurance investigators, and other officials who might need to reference the reports months or years after the original incidents occurred. Each detail needed to be accurate, each timeline precisely documented, each piece of evidence properly cataloged and preserved. Detective Morrison completed his report on the Maple Street burglary as the clock on the wall approached 10 p.m. He had produced 8 pages of single-spaced documentation that captured not only the basic facts of the crime, but also the investigative steps that had been taken, the evidence that had been gathered, and the ongoing efforts to identify and apprehend the perpetrator. The report would be reviewed by his supervisor, copied for the prosecutor's office, and filed in the permanent records that documented the department's response to crime. The quiet satisfaction of completing a thorough report was something that Detective Morrison had learned to appreciate over his years of police work. Each properly documented case represented a small victory in the ongoing effort to maintain order and justice in the community. Even cases that were never solved contributed to the larger understanding of criminal patterns and investigative techniques that helped make future cases more likely to be resolved successfully. Around him, the other detectives continued their own documentation work, each one contributing to the comprehensive record that the police department maintained of its daily encounter with human conflict and resolution. The reports they produced would join the thousands of others in the archives downstairs, becoming part of the vast catalog of stories that documented the ongoing effort to balance individual behavior with community needs. The typewriters would continue their work until the last detective finished their final report of the shift. Then the room would fall silent until the next evening, when a new group of cases would require the same careful attention to detail, the same patient translation of complex human situations into the precise language of official documentation. These reports represented more than just paperwork. They were the foundation of the criminal justice system, the carefully constructed records that made it possible to hold people accountable for their actions while also protecting the rights of both victims and accused persons. The quality of these reports often determined whether justice was served, whether victims received appropriate support, and whether communities remained safe from ongoing criminal activity. Detective Morrison gathered his completed report and placed it in the basket for supervisor review, then began organizing the files for his next case. Tomorrow would bring new incidents requiring the same careful documentation, new opportunities to serve his community through the patient work of investigation and reporting that formed the foundation of effective law enforcement. The quiet room continued its essential work, transforming the chaos of crime into the order of documentation, creating the permanent record that allowed society to understand, respond to, and learn from the endless variety of human behavior that challenged the boundaries of law and community standards. Each report added another thread to the tapestry of recorded experience that helped maintain the delicate balance between individual freedom and collective security that made civilized life possible. Asterisk. The oldest section of the police archives stretched back into corners of the basement that seemed to exist outside of normal time. Archivist Helen Kraft had worked in these depths for 23 years, long enough to know every cabinet, every filing system, every quirk of organization that had evolved over decades of changing procedures and rotating personnel. Her footsteps echoed softly against the concrete floor as she made her way through corridors lined with metal filing cabinets that held the accumulated memory of the city's encounter with crime. The air here carried the particular scent of aged paper and metal, a smell that had become as familiar to Helen as her own perfume. Each cabinet contained hundreds of files, thousands of individual pages that documented incidents stretching back to the 1940s, when the department had first begun maintaining comprehensive records of criminal investigations. The filing system had evolved over the decades, creating a complex archaeology of documentation styles that required specialized knowledge to navigate effectively. Helen paused at Cabinet Series G, which contained cases from the late 1960s, a period when the city had experienced significant social upheaval that had challenged traditional approaches to law enforcement. The files from this era were noticeably thicker than those from earlier periods, reflecting both the increasing complexity of crime and the department's growing sophistication in documentation and investigation techniques, she pulled open drawer G47, revealing rows of manila folders whose tabs had faded to barely legible pencil markings. Each folder represented hours of police work, but more importantly, each one contained human stories that had reached crisis points requiring official intervention. Helen had read thousands of these files over her years in the archives, and she had developed a deep appreciation for the patience and dedication that characterized the police work of earlier eras. The first file she selected dealt with a missing person case from 1967, involving a teenage girl named Susan Martinez who had disappeared from her family's apartment in the Riverside district. The initial report, typed on the heavy paper that the department had used during that period, bore the distinctive markings of Detective Captain Robert O'Sullivan, whose careful handwriting filled the margins with additional observations and follow-up. Notes: Susan Martinez had been 16 years old when she failed to return home from her after-school job at the local Five and Dime store. Her parents had contacted police when she missed dinner, an unusual occurrence for a girl who was described by family and friends as responsible and predictable in her habits. The initial investigation had focused on the route between the store and the Martinez family apartment, with officers canvassing businesses and residents who might have observed Susan during her usual walk home. Detective O'Sullivan's reports documented a methodical investigation that had expanded gradually as initial leads failed to provide answers. He had interviewed Susan's co-workers at the Five and Dime, her teachers at Roosevelt High School, and the various friends and acquaintances who made up her social circle. Each interview was documented in careful detail, creating a comprehensive picture of Susan's life that might reveal clues about her disappearance. The file contained photographs of Susan, including her school portrait and several candid shots taken by family members during recent holidays. She appeared as a typical teenager of the era, with carefully styled hair and a somewhat serious expression that suggested maturity beyond her years. Her school records, included in the file with permission from her parents, showed good grades and regular attendance, supporting the family's description of her as a reliable and focused young person. Detective O'Sullivan's investigation had revealed that Susan had been saving money from her job to attend secretarial school after graduation, a goal that her family supported despite their limited financial resources. She had been planning to take evening classes while continuing to work during the day, a common path for young women from working-class families who wanted to improve their employment prospects. The case had taken and improved their employment unexpected turn when Detective O'Sullivan discovered that Susan had been receiving letters from a young man named James Patterson, who was stationed with the Army at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. The correspondence, which Susan's parents had been unaware of, suggested a romantic relationship that had developed through a pen pal program organized by one of Susan's friends. Helen found herself absorbed in the careful documentation of how Detective O'Sullivan had traced this lead, working with military authorities to locate and interview James Patterson about his relationship with Susan. The young soldier had provided information that proved crucial to understanding Susan's disappearance, revealing that she had been planning to travel to North Carolina to visit him during his leave, a trip that her parents would never have approved. The investigation had concluded when Susan was located in a boarding house near Fort Bragg, where she had been staying while trying to find work that would allow her to remain close to James Patterson. Detective O'Sullivan's final reports documented the complex process of reuniting Susan with her family while also addressing the underlying conflicts that had motivated her decision to leave home without telling anyone where she was going. The resolution had required extensive mediation between Susan and her parents, with Detective O'Sullivan serving as an informal counselor who helped the family understand the pressures and desires that had led to the crisis. His reports showed remarkable patience and insight into the generational and cultural factors that had created the communication breakdown between Susan and her family. Helen appreciated the way Detective O'Sullivan had approached the case, recognizing that Susan's disappearance was not a simple matter of law enforcement, but a family crisis that required understanding and compassion rather than punishment. His documentation showed how police work in that era often involved roles that extended far beyond traditional law enforcement, encompassing social work, family counseling, and community mediation. The file contained letters from the Martinez family, written months after Susan's safe return, thanking Detective O'Sullivan for his patience and expressing their gratitude for the way he had handled their family crisis. Susan had returned to finish high school and had eventually attended secretarial school as planned, though she had also maintained her relationship with James Patterson, whom she married after his military service was completed. These letters provided a follow-up that was rarely included in modern police files, showing the long-term outcomes of cases that had been resolved through patient investigation and family-centered approaches. Helen had noticed that files from earlier eras often contained this kind of personal correspondence, suggesting that the relationship between police and community had been more intimate and ongoing than was typical in contemporary law enforcement. She returned the Martinez file to its proper place and selected another folder from the same drawer, this one dealing with a series of break-ins at local businesses during the summer of 1967. The investigating officer, Detective Lieutenant Michael Chun, had approached the case with the same methodical patience that characterized much of the police work documented in the archives. The break-ins had occurred at a variety of small businesses throughout the downtown area, including a jewelry store, a pharmacy, a small grocery store, and a clothing boutique. The pattern of theft suggested someone with knowledge of which businesses kept cash on the premises and which items would be easiest to resell quickly. Detective Chun's reports documented his systematic analysis of the similarities and differences between the various incidents. Each business had been entered through rear doors or windows, suggesting that the perpetrator was familiar with the layout of the downtown area and knew which entrances would be least visible to passing patrol cars or late-night pedestrians. The thefts had been selective rather than random, with the intruder taking only items that were both valuable and portable, leaving behind merchandise that would be difficult to transport or resell. Detective Chun had worked closely with the business owners to understand the patterns of their operations, learning which establishments counted their cash at closing time, which ones left money in registers overnight, and which ones had developed specific security procedures to protect against theft. This information allowed him to develop a profile of someone who had either worked in the downtown area or had spent considerable time observing the routines of local businesses. Investigation had been complicated by the fact that the break-ins occurred sporadically over several months, with gaps of 2 or 3 weeks between incidents. This pattern suggested that the perpetrator was not motivated by immediate financial need, but was supplementing income from another source, possibly legitimate employment that provided enough money for basic needs but not for discretionary spending. Detective Chun's breakthrough had come through patient observation rather than dramatic detective work. He had begun spending time in the downtown area during evening hours, not conducting formal surveillance, but simply becoming familiar with the normal patterns of activity and the individuals who were regularly present during the times when the break-ins were occurring. His reports documented weeks of these informal observations, noting the various people who worked late shifts, who frequented downtown establishments during evening hours, and who had legitimate reasons to be familiar with the rear entrances and security practices of local businesses. This approach required considerable time and patience, but it eventually led to the identification of several individuals who warranted closer investigation. The case had been solved when Detective Cheen observed Timothy Kowalski, a part-time janitor who worked for several downtown businesses, removing items from the back door of Henderson's pharmacy during what should have been his normal cleaning routine. Further investigation revealed that Timothy had been using his legitimate access to various businesses to study their security procedures and identify opportunities for theft. The resolution of the case had been handled with the same thoughtfulness that characterized Detective Chun's investigation. Timothy was a young man who had been struggling to support his widowed mother and younger siblings on the low wages available to someone without specialized skills or education. Detective Chun had worked with the business owners and the prosecutor's office to develop a resolution that addressed both the crimes and the underlying circumstances that had motivated them. Timothy had been required to make full restitution to all the businesses he had burglarized, but he had also been connected with a job training program that would allow him to develop skills that would lead to better employment opportunities. Several of the business owners had agreed to provide character references for Timothy once he completed his community service, recognizing that his crimes had been motivated by family responsibility rather than greed or malice. Helen found these older cases fascinating not only for their investigative techniques but also for their approaches to resolution that seemed to consider the broader social context of criminal behavior. The officers whose work was documented in these files had operated in an era when there was more time for understanding the Kenjun circumstances that led to crime and more flexibility in developing solutions that addressed underlying causes rather than simply punishing criminal acts. She pulled another file from a different section of the drawer, this one dealing with a domestic violence case that had required months of patient intervention. The case involved the Donnelly family, where alcohol abuse had created a pattern of violence that had escalated to the point where neighbors were regularly calling police to intervene in loud and sometimes dangerous domestic disputes. Officer Patricia Williams had been assigned to work with the Donnelly family, making regular visits to their home and developing relationships with both Robert and Mary Donnelly that allowed her to understand the complex dynamics that were creating the ongoing crisis. Her reports showed a sophisticated understanding of how alcohol addiction, economic stress, and family history combined to create situations that required more than simple law enforcement responses. The file contained detailed notes from Officer Williams's conversations with both family members, conducted separately to allow each one to speak honestly about their fears, frustrations, and hopes for resolving their situation. Robert Donnelly had acknowledged his drinking problem but expressed skepticism about his ability to change patterns that had developed over many years. Mary Donnelly had described her fear of her husband's violence, but also her economic dependence on his income and her uncertainty about alternatives. Officer Williams had worked with social service agencies, alcoholism treatment programs, and family counseling services to develop a comprehensive approach to the Donnelly family's problems. Her documentation showed how she had coordinated between various agencies to ensure that the family received consistent support while also maintaining the law enforcement oversight necessary to protect Mary Donnelly's safety. The case had required Officer Williams to make numerous court appearances, providing testimony about the pattern of violence while also advocating for treatment rather than purely punitive responses to Robert Donnelly's behavior. Her reports documented the complex legal proceedings that had eventually resulted in a court order requiring Robert to complete alcohol treatment and anger management programs while also providing protection for Mary through a restraining order that would be enforced through regular police monitoring. The resolution of the case had taken more than a year, with Officer Williams maintaining contact with the family throughout. Robert's treatment process and Mary's participation in support programs for families affected by domestic violence. The final reports in the file documented a successful outcome, with Robert completing his treatment programs and the family maintaining stability without further police intervention. Helen had noticed that domestic violence cases from this era often involved this kind of long-term police engagement, with officers serving as ongoing liaisons between families and the various social service agencies that provided support for complex family problems. The approach required considerable time and emotional investment from officers, but the documentation suggested that it was often more effective than the crisis response model that had become more common in later years. Moving to a different section of the archives, Helen selected files from the 1950s, an era when the city had been smaller and police work had involved even more intimate knowledge of community residents and their circumstances. The filing system from this period was simpler but also more personal, with many files containing handwritten notes that provided insights into the officer's thoughts and observations that went beyond official requirements. One file that caught her attention dealt with a case of juvenile delinquency involving a group of teenage boys who had been engaged in what the reports described as increasingly serious pranks that were beginning to cause real property damage and community concern. The investigating officer, Sergeant Frank Murphy, had approached the situation not as a law enforcement problem, but as a community issue that required understanding and creative solutions. The boys involved were all from working-class families in the same neighborhood, and their activities had begun as harmless mischief, but had gradually escalated to include breaking windows, damaging property, and disrupting local businesses. Sergeant Murphy's reports documented his efforts to understand what was motivating this behavior and whether there were underlying issues that needed to be addressed. His investigation had revealed that the boys were struggling with the transition from childhood to adulthood in a community that provided few opportunities for young people to engage in meaningful activities or develop skills that would lead to good employment. Most of them were not academically inclined and would not be continuing their education beyond high school, but there were no programs available to help them develop trade skills or find their way into stable adult roles. Sergeant Murphy had worked with community organizations, local businesses, and the boys' families to develop what he called a constructive engagement program, rather than simply punishing the boys for their disruptive behavior. The program channeled their energy into projects that benefited the community while also teaching them useful skills. The boys had been organized into work crews that helped with community improvement projects, including painting public buildings, cleaning up vacant lots, and assisting elderly residents with yard work and home maintenance. These activities were supervised by adult volunteers who served as mentors and teachers, helping the boys learn both practical skills and appropriate workplace behavior. The program had been so successful that it had been continued even after the original problem had been resolved, eventually becoming a permanent part of the community's youth services. Sergeant Murphy's final reports documented how several of the boys who had been involved in the original incidents had gone on to successful careers in construction and other trades, largely as a result of the skills and connections they had developed through the community service program. These files from earlier eras consistently showed approaches to law enforcement that emphasized understanding, patience, and community-based solutions rather than purely punitive responses to criminal behavior. Helen had begun to think of them as representing a different philosophy of police work, one that saw officers as integral parts of the communities they served rather than external agents, whose primary role was to enforce laws and maintain order. The physical condition of these older files also told stories about the evolution of police work over the decades. The paper was heavier and more durable than modern reports, suggesting that documentation was expected to last for many years. The typing was done on manual typewriters that left distinctive impressions on the paper, and many reports contained handwritten additions and corrections that showed the care officers took in ensuring that their documentation was complete and accurate. Helen noticed that the older files also contained more personal elements than modern police reports. Officers often included their own observations about the social and economic factors that contributed to criminal behavior, and they frequently documented their efforts to connect offenders with resources that might help them avoid future problems. This approach required officers to have extensive knowledge of their communities and access to a network of social service providers who could address the underlying causes of criminal behavior. As she continued working through the archives, Helen found herself developing a deep appreciation for the officers whose work was documented in these files. They had operated in an era when police work required not only law enforcement skills, but also social work capabilities, community organizing abilities, and the patience to work with complex human problems that had no simple solutions. The archives represented more than just historical records. They were a repository of wisdom about effective approaches to law enforcement that emphasized understanding, compassion, and community engagement. The officers whose work was documented in these files had understood that their job was not simply to arrest criminals, but to help maintain the social fabric that made community life possible. The dust motes continued their slow dance in the filtered light that found its way into the deepest corners of the archives, each particle carrying fragments of the thousands of stories contained in the filing cabinets that lined these quiet corridors. Helen's work preserving and organizing these files was itself a form of police work, ensuring that the lessons learned by earlier generations of officers would remain available to guide future approaches to law enforcement and community safety. In the silence of the archives, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of decades of police work, Helen felt connected to the long tradition of public service that had motivated the officers whose stories filled these files. Their patient, thoughtful approaches to complex human problems had created communities where people could live safely and peacefully together, and their documented experiences provided a guide for continuing that essential work in changing times. The old courthouse on 5th Street had been serving the city's judicial needs for nearly 8 decades. Its limestone facade weathered by countless seasons but still maintaining the dignified presence that had been intended by its original architects. Night security guard James Patterson had walked these halls for 15 years, long enough to know every creak in the wooden floors, every shadow cast by the tall windows, every corner where silence gathered like dust. During the daylight hours, the building buzzed with the activity of justice being administered, lawyers hurrying between courtrooms, witnesses waiting nervously in corridors, families gathering to support defendants or victims through the complex processes of legal resolution. But in the hours after midnight, when the last clerk had locked the final filing cabinet and the last attorney had gathered their papers and departed, the courthouse settled into a different kind of existence, one where the weight of accumulated decisions seemed to press against the walls. With almost physical presence, Patterson's rounds took him through courtrooms that had witnessed thousands of cases over the decades, each one a small drama of human conflict seeking resolution through the careful application of law and precedent. Courtroom A, the largest and most formal of the 6 chambers, had been the site of the city's most significant criminal trials, its elevated judge's bench and mahogany paneling lending gravity to proceedings that determined guilt or innocence, freedom or confinement, justice or its absence. The empty jury box in courtroom A could seat 12 citizens who would be called upon to weigh evidence and render verdicts that would change lives forever. Patterson often paused during his rounds to consider the weight of responsibility that ordinary people accepted when they agreed to serve on juries, sitting in judgment of their fellow citizens based on evidence presented by attorneys whose job it was to construct competing narratives from the same set of facts. The judges' chambers behind. Courtroom. It contained law books that represented centuries of legal thinking, their leather bindings holding the accumulated wisdom of countless judges who had struggled with questions of justice, mercy, and the appropriate response to human failings. Judge Margaret Harrison had occupied these chambers for 12 years, and her careful approach to criminal cases had earned the respect of both prosecutors and defense attorneys who appeared before her. Judge Harrison's desk held files for cases that would be heard in the coming weeks, each one representing hours of preparation by attorneys, investigators, and court personnel who worked to ensure that justice was administered fairly and thoroughly. The files contained police reports, witness statements, expert testimony, and legal briefs that would be carefully considered before sentences were imposed or verdicts rendered. Patterson's security rounds included the holding cells located in the basement of the courthouse, where defendants awaited trial or sentencing in rooms designed more for safety than comfort. The cells were clean and well maintained, but their concrete walls and heavy doors created an atmosphere that reminded anyone who entered of the serious consequences that could follow criminal conviction. Cell number 3 had housed hundreds of defendants over the years, each one waiting to learn their fate through legal processes that moved with deliberate care rather than speed. Some had been there for only a few hours while bail was arranged, others for days or weeks as complex cases made their way through the court system. The small space had contained fear, hope, remorse, and resignation in equal measure, emotions that seemed to linger in the air long after their sources had moved on to whatever resolution the law had provided. The cell contained a narrow bench, a small sink, and a toilet, the basic necessities that allowed human beings to maintain dignity even while confined. Patterson had observed that defendants often used their time in these cells to reflect on the choices that had brought them to this point, and attorneys frequently reported that their clients seemed more ready to accept responsibility and work toward resolution after spending time in the stark environment of pretrial detention. Adjacent to the holding cells was the interview room, where attorneys met with their clients to prepare defenses or negotiate plea agreements. The room was furnished simply, with a table and chairs that had heard thousands of difficult conversations between lawyers and clients who faced uncertain futures. Many defendants had made the decision to accept responsibility for their actions in this room, working with their attorneys to develop approaches to sentencing that acknowledged their crimes while also demonstrating their commitment to making amends. Patterson's rounds also included the Victim Services Office, where social workers and victim advocates provided support for people who had been harmed by crime and needed assistance navigating the complex legal processes that would determine how their cases were resolved. The office maintained a library of resources for crime victims, including information about their rights, explanations of court procedures, and contact information for counseling and support services. The Victim Services staff worked closely with prosecutors to ensure that victims' voices were heard during legal proceedings, but they also provided ongoing support that extended beyond the resolution of individual cases. Many victims struggled with the emotional aftermath of crime long after legal proceedings had concluded, and the Victim Services Office served as a bridge to long-term counseling and support resources that helped people rebuild their lives. The courthouse also contained administrative offices where probation officers worked with defendants who had been sentenced to supervised release rather than incarceration. These officers maintained caseloads that required regular contact with probationers, monitoring their compliance with court orders while also providing support and resources that helped them reintegrate into community life. Probation Officer Michael Rodriguez had worked in the courthouse for 8 years, developing relationships with community organizations that provided employment assistance, substance abuse treatment, mental health counseling, and other services that address the underlying issues that often contributed to criminal behavior. His office contained files for more than 100 active cases, each one representing a person who was working to rebuild their life after making mistakes that had brought them into contact with the criminal justice system. The probation office maintained connections with employers who were willing to hire people with criminal records, recognizing that stable employment was one of the most important factors in preventing recidivism. Rodriguez had developed relationships with construction companies, restaurants, retail establishments, and service businesses that had found success in hiring people who were motivated to prove themselves worthy of second chances. His work also involved regular communication with treatment providers who worked with probationers struggling with addiction, mental health issues, or other problems that had contributed to their criminal behavior. The courthouse served as a coordination center for these various support services, bringing together resources that might otherwise be difficult for ex-offenders to access on their own. The third floor of the courthouse housed the law library, where attorneys researched precedents and legal strategies for the cases they would argue in the courtrooms below. The library contained thousands of volumes of case law, statutes, and legal commentary that provided the foundation for arguments about guilt or innocence, appropriate sentences, and the proper application of legal principles to specific situations. Late at night, when the library was closed and empty, the books seemed to hold the accumulated wisdom of centuries of legal thinking, their pages containing arguments and decisions that had shaped the development of justice, systems designed to balance individual rights with community needs. The law library represented humanity's ongoing effort to create fair and consistent approaches to resolving conflicts and addressing harmful behavior. Attorney Sarah Mitchell often worked late in the law library, preparing defenses for clients who faced serious criminal charges. Her research involved reading through hundreds of pages of case law, looking for precedents that might support arguments for reduced charges or alternative sentences that would allow her clients to make amends for their actions while avoiding the lengthy prison terms that could destroy their chances for successful reintegration into society. Mitchell's approach to criminal defense emphasized understanding the circumstances that had led to her clients' legal troubles, working to present comprehensive pictures of their lives that helped judges and juries understand the context in which criminal acts had occurred. Her briefs often included information about her clients' family backgrounds, employment histories, substance abuse struggles, mental health issues, and other factors that might explain, though not excuse, their criminal behavior. The courthouse basement also contained the records storage area where transcripts of trials were preserved for future reference and appeal processes. Court reporter Linda Walsh had transcribed thousands of hours of testimony over her 20-year career, creating verbatim records of legal proceedings that captured not only the words spoken, but also the pauses, interruptions, and emotional moments that provided context for understanding how cases had unfolded. These transcripts represented the permanent record of how justice had been administered in specific cases, documenting the careful processes through which evidence was presented, arguments were made, and decisions were reached. Walsh took pride in the accuracy of her work, understanding that her transcripts might be reviewed years later by appellate courts or other officials who needed to understand exactly what had occurred during original proceedings. The courthouse also contained a small chapel where defendants, victims, and family members could find quiet space for reflection and prayer during the stressful processes of legal proceedings. The chapel was non-denominational, designed to provide comfort for people of all faiths who were struggling with the aftermath of crime and the uncertainty of legal resolution. Many defendants had found peace in the chapel while waiting for sentencing, using the quiet space to reflect on their actions and prepare themselves mentally for whatever consequences the law would impose. Victims' families had also used the chapel as a place to grieve losses and find strength to participate in legal proceedings that required them to relive traumatic experiences in public. Forums. The courthouse cafeteria, closed now in the early morning hours, had served thousands of meals to jurors, attorneys, court personnel, and visitors who spent long days participating in legal proceedings. The space had often served as an informal meeting place where plea negotiations were discussed, where attorneys consulted with clients about strategy, and where families gathered to support each other through difficult legal processes. Even closed and empty, the cafeteria retained something of the community atmosphere that had characterized its daytime operation. Many important conversations had occurred around its simple tables, as people involved in legal cases found ways to communicate and negotiate that led to resolutions satisfactory to all parties involved. Patterson's security rounds included checking the evidence storage room, where physical evidence from criminal cases was preserved for trial and appeal processes. The room contained hundreds of boxes and envelopes containing items that had been crucial to determining guilt or innocence. In cases that had passed through the courthouse over the years, some evidence had been returned to owners after cases were resolved, but much remained in storage as permanent reminders of crimes that had been committed and justice that had been administered. Each piece of evidence had played a role in legal proceedings that had changed lives and affected families, representing the careful processes through which facts were established and responsibility was assigned. The courthouse roof provided a view of the city that surrounded the building, a perspective that reminded anyone who climbed the stairs to the top floor that the work conducted within these walls affected the broader community in countless ways. The decisions made in the courtrooms below rippled outward through families, neighborhoods, and social networks, influencing how people understood safety, justice, and their obligations to each other. From the roof, Patterson could see the neighborhoods where many of the defendants had lived, the streets where crimes had been committed, and the homes where victims and their families had worked to rebuild their lives after experiencing harm. The courthouse stood at the center of these communities, serving as the institution where conflicts were resolved and justice was administered according to principles that had evolved over centuries of human experience. The empty courtrooms below held the echoes of thousands of cases that had been resolved through careful application of legal processes designed to balance competing demands for justice, mercy, and public safety. Each case had been unique, involving specific individuals whose lives had intersected with the law in ways that required careful consideration of evidence, circumstances, and appropriate responses. The courthouse represented society's ongoing commitment to resolving conflicts through peaceful means rather than violence or vigilante justice. The building and its procedures embodied the principle that even people who had committed serious crimes deserved fair treatment and careful consideration of their circumstances before punishment was imposed. As Patterson completed his security rounds and settled into his office for the remainder of his shift, he reflected on the important role that the courthouse played in maintaining the social order that allowed people to live together peacefully. The building served as a physical reminder that justice was possible, that conflicts could be resolved fairly, and that even serious crimes could be addressed through processes that upheld human dignity, while also protecting community safety. The silence of the empty courthouse carried within it the weight of all the decisions that had been made within its walls, all the lives that had been changed by its proceedings, and all the hopes for justice that had been fulfilled or disappointed through the careful administration of law. In the pre-dawn hours, when the building rested between the dramas that would unfold with the next day's court sessions, it stood as a monument to humanity's ongoing effort to create fair and peaceful ways of living together in complex societies. Mrs. Elena Vasquez had lived on Maple Street for 37 years, long enough to witness the neighborhood's transformation from young families with children to an established community, where many of the original residents had grown old together. Her small front porch provided an excellent vantage point for observing the daily rhythms of the street, and over the decades she had developed the kind of intimate knowledge of her neighbors' lives that came from paying attention to the small details that others might overlook. When the burglaries began in the spring of 1985, Mrs. Vasquez had been among the first to notice the subtle changes in the neighborhood's atmosphere. People began locking doors that had previously remained open during the day. Curtains were drawn more tightly in the evenings, and conversations at the corner grocery store carried an undercurrent of concern that had not been present before. The first incident had occurred at the Morrison house, 3 doors down from Mrs. Vasquez's own home. Sarah Morrison, a single mother who worked as a nurse at the county hospital, had returned from her night shift to find her back door standing open and several valuable items missing from her bedroom. The violation of her private space had been more disturbing to Sarah than the loss of her grandmother's jewelry and the small television that had been taken from her living room. Mrs. Vasquez had been among the first neighbors to offer support to Sarah, bringing homemade soup and sitting with her while she waited for the locksmith to install new deadbolts on all her doors. They had talked about the feeling of vulnerability that comes when the security of home is breached, and Mrs. Vasquez had shared stories from her own childhood about how communities in her native Mexico had worked together to protect each other from similar threats. The second burglary had affected the Chun family, who lived directly across the street from Mrs. Vasquez. David and Linda Chun had been away for the weekend, visiting Linda's parents in the next county, when someone had broken into their garage and stolen David's collection of woodworking tools, along with 2 bicycles that belonged to their teenage children. Mrs. Vasquez had noticed the garage door standing partially open when she retrieved her morning newspaper, recognizing immediately that something was wrong because David Chun was meticulous about securing his workshop. Her call to the police had initiated the investigation that would eventually connect this incident to a pattern of similar crimes throughout the neighborhood. The response from law enforcement had been thorough and professional, but Mrs. Vasquez had observed that the official investigation addressed only the immediate criminal acts without considering the broader impact that these violations were having on the community's sense of safety and cohesion. She had begun to think about ways that neighbors might work together to address not only the immediate security concerns, but also the underlying social factors that made their neighborhood vulnerable to this kind of crime. Her first step had been to organize informal coffee gatherings where neighbors could share information about suspicious activities and coordinate simple security measures like ensuring that someone was always present to receive packages and watch for unusual activity during normal work hours. These gatherings had taken place in Mrs. Vasquez's living room, which was large enough to accommodate 8 or 10 people and had the comfortable, non-threatening atmosphere that encouraged open conversation. The discussions had revealed that many neighbors had observed suspicious activities, but had not known how to report them effectively or whether their observations were significant enough to warrant police attention. Mrs. Chun had mentioned seeing an unfamiliar van parked on the street for several hours on different occasions, always during daytime hours when most residents were at work. Mr. Patterson from the corner house had noticed someone walking through the alley behind the houses, appearing to examine backyards and garage doors rather than simply passing through. Mrs. Vasquez had worked with Officer Martinez, the community liaison officer assigned to their district, to establish a neighborhood watch program that formalized these information sharing activities while also providing residents with training in how to observe and report suspicious activities effectively. The program had required several evening meetings where Officer Martinez explained how residents could contribute to crime prevention without putting themselves at risk. The neighborhood watch meetings had evolved into something more comprehensive than simple crime prevention, becoming a forum where longtime residents like Mrs. Vasquez could share their knowledge of local history and neighborhood dynamics with newer residents who were still learning how to fit into the community's established patterns. These conversations had revealed that many of the newer residents felt disconnected from their neighbors and uncertain about local customs and expectations. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had moved to Maple Street 6 months before the burglaries began, had expressed gratitude for the opportunity to learn more about her neighbors and their shared concerns. As a working single mother, she had found it difficult to establish the kind of community connections that came more naturally to residents like Mrs. Vasquez, who had been part of the neighborhood for decades. The watch program had also provided a structure for addressing some of the underlying social issues that Officer Martinez explained often contributed to property crime in residential neighborhoods. Many of the burglaries in their area had been committed by teenagers or young adults who lived in the neighborhood but felt disconnected from positive community activities and adult mentorship opportunities that Mrs. Vasquez had proposed, expanding their neighborhood activities to include events that would engage young people in positive ways, recognizing that crime prevention was more effective when it addressed root causes, rather than simply increasing surveillance and security measures. Her suggestion had led to the establishment of regular community gatherings that brought together residents of all ages around shared activities and common concerns. The first community event had been a neighborhood cleanup day, where residents worked together to pick up litter, trim overgrown vegetation, and address minor maintenance issues that had made some areas of the neighborhood appear neglected and uncared for. Mrs. Vasquez had organized the event with help from several other longtime residents, providing lunch and coordination while neighbors contributed their time and energy to improving their shared environment. The cleanup day had attracted participation from more than 40 households, including many families who had not previously been involved in neighborhood activities. The work had provided opportunities for residents to have conversations while engaged in shared tasks, creating natural connections between people who might otherwise have remained strangers. Despite living in close proximity, teenage residents had been encouraged to participate through a community service program that provided recognition for their contributions while also connecting them with adult neighbors who could serve as mentors and positive influences. Mrs. Vasquez had observed that many of the young people seemed eager to contribute to community improvement when they were given clear roles and appropriate recognition for their efforts. The success of the cleanup day had led to the establishment of regular community meetings where residents could discuss ongoing concerns and coordinate responses to issues that affected the neighborhood's quality of life. These meetings rotated between different households, allowing various residents to serve as hosts while also ensuring that the gatherings remained informal and welcoming rather than bureaucratic or intimidating. One of the most significant outcomes of these community-building efforts had been the establishment of an informal support network for residents who were struggling with personal challenges that made them vulnerable to becoming either victims or perpetrators of crime. Mrs. Vasquez had recognized that several neighborhood families were dealing with unemployment, substance abuse, domestic violence, or other problems that could contribute to community instability if left unaddressed. The support network operated through quiet, private assistance rather than formal programs that might stigmatize people who were struggling. When Mr. Johnson lost his job at the factory, several neighbors had arranged informal work opportunities that helped him maintain his income and self-respect while he searched for new employment. When the Williams family was dealing with their teenage son's substance abuse problems, Mrs. Vasquez had connected them with other parents who had faced similar challenges and could provide emotional support and practical advice. These informal support systems had required Mrs. Vasquez and other community leaders to develop skills in recognizing signs of distress and knowing how to offer help in ways that preserved people's dignity, while also addressing their genuine needs. The approach had been based on the understanding that communities were stronger when residents felt connected to and supported by their neighbors, rather than isolated and struggling alone with their problems. The neighborhood's crime prevention efforts had also included practical measures like improving lighting in areas that had been poorly illuminated, organizing residents to maintain visibility of public spaces that had previously been neglected, and establishing communication systems that allowed neighbors to respond quickly to emergency situations. These physical improvements had been coordinated with local government services and utility companies to ensure that changes were properly implemented and maintained. Mrs. Vasquez had worked with the city's Community Development Office to access grants and technical assistance for neighborhood improvement projects, learning how to navigate bureaucratic processes that allowed residents to make changes that improved safety and quality of life. Her efforts had resulted in the installation of additional streetlights, the repair of sidewalks that had become hazardous, and the establishment of small park areas where residents could gather for informal socializing. The relationship between these community improvement efforts and crime prevention had become clear over time, as the neighborhood experienced a significant reduction in property crimes following the implementation of comprehensive community building activities. Officer Martinez had observed that areas with strong social networks and active resident engagement consistently had lower crime rates than neighborhoods where residents remained isolated from each other and disengaged from community improvement efforts. The most meaningful aspect of the neighborhood's transformation had been the development of what Mrs. Vasquez thought of as a culture of mutual responsibility, where residents understood that their individual well-being was connected to the health and stability of the broader community. This understanding had led to ongoing efforts to support struggling families, mentor young people, and address problems before they escalated to the point where law enforcement intervention became necessary. The informal mentorship relationships that had developed between adult residents and neighborhood teenagers had been particularly effective in providing positive alternatives to the peer influences that sometimes led young people toward criminal activity. Mrs. Patterson had begun working with Maria Santos, a 16-year-old whose family was struggling with economic pressures that had made her vulnerable to involvement with older teenagers who supplemented their income through petty theft and drug dealing. The mentorship relationship had provided Maria with adult guidance and support that helped her focus on her education and develop skills that would lead to legitimate employment opportunities. Mrs. Patterson had also connected Maria's family with social services that addressed their immediate economic needs while also providing long-term assistance with budgeting, job training, and other support that improved their overall stability. These individual relationships had multiplied throughout the neighborhood, creating a network of informal support and guidance that strengthened families and provided alternatives to the social isolation that often contributed to community problems. Mrs. Vasquez had observed that neighborhoods where residents knew and cared about each other's welfare were naturally more resistant to crime and more effective at addressing problems before they required formal intervention. The success of their community building efforts had attracted attention from other neighborhoods facing similar challenges, leading Mrs. Vasquez to share her experiences and insights with residents who wanted to develop their own community organizing initiatives. She had spoken at community meetings throughout the city, explaining how ordinary residents could work together to improve safety and quality of life through approaches that emphasized relationship building rather than enforcement or exclusion. Her presentations had emphasized that effective community organizing required patience, persistence, and a genuine commitment to understanding and addressing the underlying causes of community problems, rather than simply responding to their most visible symptoms. The approach required residents to move beyond their individual concerns to develop shared responsibility for the well-being of their neighbors and the health of their community as a whole. The Neighborhood Watch program that had begun as a response to burglaries had evolved into a comprehensive community development initiative that addressed housing, employment, education, and social services in addition to public safety concerns. Mrs. Vasquez had learned that these various issues were interconnected and that lasting improvements required coordinated responses that addressed multiple aspects of community life simultaneously. The transformation of Maple Street had taken several years to achieve and it required ongoing effort from multiple residents who shared the vision of creating a neighborhood where people could live safely and peacefully together. The process had not been without challenges, as residents had needed to learn how to work together across differences of age, ethnicity, economic status, and personal background that sometimes created misunderstandings or conflicts. Mrs. Vasquez had served as an informal mediator for some of these conflicts, using her long experience in the neighborhood and her natural diplomatic skills to help residents find common ground and develop mutual understanding. Her approach had been based on the belief that most conflicts arose from miscommunication or misunderstanding rather than fundamental incompatibility, and that patient conversation could usually identify solutions that addressed everyone's legitimate concerns. The lasting impact of these community-building efforts had been the creation of social bonds that continued to strengthen over time, providing the foundation for ongoing collaboration and mutual support that made the neighborhood more resilient in the face of future challenges. Mrs. Vasquez had observed that residents who felt connected to and supported by their neighbors were better able to cope with personal difficulties and less likely to engage in behaviors that harmed the community. As evenings settled over Maple Street, Mrs. Vasquez often reflected on the changes that had occurred in her neighborhood over the years, following the burglaries that had initially brought residents together in concern and fear. The community that had emerged from those challenging times was stronger, more connected, and more capable of addressing problems through cooperative effort than it had been before the crisis that had catalyzed their organizing efforts. The quiet strength of neighborhoods like Maple Street represented the foundation of community safety and well-being, built not through surveillance and enforcement, but through the patient work of building relationships and addressing problems at their roots. In the gentle evening light, as neighbors tended their gardens and children played safely in the streets, the success of their collective efforts was visible in the ordinary rhythms of peaceful community life. Sergeant Maria Santos had worked the night shift at Central Station for 11 years, long enough to understand the particular rhythm that governed police work during the hours when most of the city slept. The building took on a different character after 10 p.m., when the day shift had completed their reports and departed, leaving behind a skeleton crew to monitor the radio calls that filtered in from patrol units working the quiet streets. The station's main desk area, which buzzed with activity during daylight hours, settled into a peaceful hum of essential operations conducted by officers who had learned to appreciate the contemplative quality of night work. The phones rang less frequently, walk-in complaints became rare, and the steady work of processing the day's incidents into permanent records could proceed without the constant interruptions that characterized busier shifts. Sergeant Santos occupied the watch commander's desk, a position that required her to oversee the small crew of officers who handled administrative duties during overnight hours while also monitoring radio traffic from the patrol units that continued to respond to calls throughout the night. Her desk was positioned to provide a clear view of the entire operations area, allowing her to supervise activities while also maintaining the paperwork that documented each shift's activities for review. By day shift supervisors, the night shift attracted officers who preferred the quieter pace and the opportunity to focus on thorough documentation without the pressure of constant new calls demanding immediate attention. Detective Rodriguez, who had requested assignment to nights after 15 years of day shift work, used the slower pace to conduct follow-up investigations that required careful attention to detail and patient analysis of evidence that had been gathered during initial responses to crimes. His desk, positioned near the file cabinets that contained active case folders, was organized with the methodical precision that characterized officers who had learned to appreciate the importance of comprehensive record keeping. Each case file was maintained in a specific order that allowed him to track the progress of investigations through the various stages that led from initial incident reports to final disposition through arrest, prosecution, or administrative closure. The night shift provided ideal conditions for the kind of analytical work that Rodriguez specialized in, connecting seemingly unrelated incidents into patterns that revealed the activities of serial offenders or organized groups that operated across multiple jurisdictions. His desk was equipped with maps of the city, marked with colored pins that indicated the locations and types of crimes that had occurred over recent months, creating visual representations of criminal activity that helped identify trends and predict future incidents. Officer Jennifer Park, who worked the evidence processing station during night hours, maintained the chain of custody documentation that ensured physical evidence from crime scenes was properly cataloged and preserved for use in trials that might occur months or years after initial collection. Her work required meticulous attention to detail and careful adherence to procedures that had been developed to prevent contamination or loss of evidence that could prove crucial to successful prosecutions. The evidence room, adjacent to Park's workstation, contained hundreds of items in various stages of processing, from recently collected evidence awaiting initial analysis to materials that had been held for years, pending the resolution of complex cases that moved slowly through the court system. Each item was tagged, photographed, and documented with forms that created permanent records of its collection, handling, and analysis by forensic specialists. Park's overnight shift provided the quiet environment necessary for the careful work of organizing and cataloging evidence that had been collected during the previous day's investigations. Her systematic approach ensured that nothing was overlooked or misplaced, maintaining the integrity of evidence storage systems that could be crucial to the success of prosecutions that depended on physical proof of criminal activity. The radio communications area, staffed by dispatcher Luis Martinez during the night shift, served as the nerve center that connected patrol units with the station and coordinated responses to calls that continued to come in throughout the overnight hours. Martinez had worked communications for 8 years, developing the calm, professional demeanor that was essential for managing emergency situations while also providing the steady presence that supported officers working alone in patrol cars throughout the city. The dispatch console's multiple screens displayed maps of patrol unit locations, status reports from officers in the field, and queues of pending calls that awaited response when units became available. Martinez monitored these systems with the practiced attention of someone who understood that officer safety depended on maintaining constant awareness of where each unit was located and what types of situations they were handling. The overnight hours brought different types of calls than the day shift typically handled, with a higher proportion of domestic disturbances, break-ins discovered by security guards, and incidents involving intoxicated individuals who required medical attention or protective custody until they could be safely released. These calls often required patience rather than urgency, with officers spending considerable time talking with people who were experiencing personal crises that had reached the point where police intervention was necessary. Detective Williams, who specialized in domestic violence cases, used her night shift assignment to conduct follow-up interviews with victims who were often more willing to speak honestly about their situations during quiet evening hours when they felt less pressure from family members or employers who might disapprove of their cooperation with police investigations. Her office, located in a corner of the station that provided privacy and comfort, was designed to encourage open communication with people who had experienced trauma. The domestic violence cases that Williams handled during night shifts often required hours of patient conversation as victims worked through their fears and concerns about participating in prosecutions that could have significant consequences for their family relationships and economic security. Many victims needed time to understand their legal options and to develop safety plans that would protect them from retaliation while also addressing the underlying issues that had created dangerous situations. Williams had decorated her office with plants and comfortable furniture that created a non-threatening environment where victims could feel safe discussing their experiences and exploring their options for addressing domestic violence situations. Her approach emphasized understanding the complex family dynamics that often made it difficult for victims to leave abusive relationships or to cooperate with prosecutions that could result in the incarceration of family members they depended on for economic support. The night shift also provided opportunities for community outreach activities that were difficult to conduct during busier daytime hours. Officer Thompson, who served as the station's community liaison, used his overnight assignment to visit businesses, community centers, and neighborhood organizations during their evening meetings, when working residents could participate in discussions about crime, prevention, and community policing initiatives. Thompson's community outreach work had been instrumental in developing the My Neighborhood Watch programs that had proven effective in reducing property crimes in residential areas throughout the city. His evening presentations provided residents with practical information about security measures while also encouraging them to develop the kinds of social connections that made communities naturally more resistant to criminal activity. The quiet atmosphere of the night shift allowed Thompson to prepare detailed presentations and educational materials that helped residents understand how they could contribute to community safety without putting themselves at risk. His work emphasized the importance of observation and communication rather than direct intervention, teaching residents how to be effective witnesses and how to provide useful information to investigators. The station's small kitchen area served as an informal gathering place where night shift officers could take breaks from their individual assignments and share information about cases they were working on or discuss concerns about ongoing investigations. These informal conversations often led to insights that helped solve cases, as officers who worked different specialties brought their unique perspectives to bear on complex problems that required interdisciplinary approaches. Sergeant Santos encouraged these informal consultations, understanding that the collaborative environment of the night shift was one of its greatest advantages over the more hectic pace of day shift operations. Officers had time to think carefully about their cases and to seek input from colleagues whose experience and expertise could provide valuable insights into investigative approaches or evidence analysis. The night shifts slower pace also allowed for more thorough training of newer officers who benefited from working alongside experienced personnel who had time to provide detailed instruction and guidance. Officer Ramirez, who had joined the force 6 months earlier, was assigned to work closely with Detective Rodriguez as part of a mentorship program that provided intensive training in investigative techniques and report writing. The mentorship relationship allowed Ramirez to observe and participate in complex investigations while also receiving immediate feedback on his work from an experienced detective who could identify areas for improvement and provide specific suggestions for developing investigative skills. The night shift environment provided ideal conditions for this kind of intensive training, as cases could be discussed and analyzed without the time pressure that often prevented thorough instruction during busier shifts. The station's holding cells, monitored by Officer Davis during overnight hours, housed individuals who had been arrested during evening hours and were awaiting arraignment or transfer to county facilities. Davis had developed expertise in managing detainees who were experiencing withdrawal from alcohol or drugs, mental health crises, or simply the stress of being confined while facing uncertain legal consequences. His approach to detention management emphasized maintaining human dignity while also ensuring safety for both detainees and staff. Davis had received specialized training in crisis intervention and de-escalation techniques that helped him manage difficult situations without resorting to force or confrontation. His calm demeanor and professional approach often had a stabilizing effect on detainees who were experiencing high levels of anxiety or distress. The overnight hours provided opportunities for Davis to have extended conversations with detainees who were willing to discuss the circumstances that had led to their arrests. These conversations sometimes provided valuable intelligence about criminal activities or helped identify underlying problems like addiction or mental illness that could be addressed through treatment rather than incarceration. Davis worked closely with social service agencies that provided emergency assistance for detainees who needed help with housing, employment, substance abuse treatment, or other services that could help them avoid future contact with the criminal justice system. His position allowed him to serve as a bridge between the law enforcement and social service systems, connecting arrested individuals with resources that addressed the root causes of their legal problems. The night shift's administrative functions included processing warrants, updating criminal history records, and maintaining communication with other law enforcement agencies throughout the region. These tasks required careful attention to detail and adherence to strict procedures that ensured the accuracy and security of sensitive information that could affect ongoing investigations or court proceedings. Officer Chang, who specialized in warrant processing during night hours, maintained databases that tracked wanted individuals and coordinated with other jurisdictions when arrests were made that involved outstanding warrants from multiple agencies. Her work required constant communication with courts, probation departments, and other law enforcement agencies to ensure that all legal requirements were met when wanted individuals were taken into custody. The warrant processing system that Chang maintained was crucial to ensuring that individuals who had failed to appear for court dates or who had violated probation conditions were properly identified and processed when they came into contact with law enforcement. Her careful documentation and communication with other agencies helped prevent wanted individuals from being inadvertently released due to administrative errors or communication failures. As the night progressed and the clock approached the early morning hours when day shift personnel would begin arriving, the night shift officers completed their final reports and prepared briefing materials that would update incoming personnel about ongoing investigations and incidents that had occurred during overnight hours. This transition period required careful communication to ensure that important information was properly transferred between shifts. Sergeant Santos conducted the shift briefing that provided day shift supervisors with comprehensive summaries of overnight activities, ongoing investigations that required follow-up during day hours, and any emerging issues that might affect the next shift's operations. Her briefings were thorough and well-organized, ensuring that day shift officers had all the information they needed to continue investigations and respond appropriately to developing situations. The night shift represented a crucial component of continuous law enforcement operations, providing the steady foundation of documentation, analysis, and administrative support that enabled the police department to maintain effective responses to criminal activity throughout all hours of the day. The officers who chose night shift assignments understood that their work was essential to the overall effectiveness of law enforcement efforts. Even though their contributions often received less public attention than the more visible patrol and detective operations that occurred during daytime hours. In the quiet hours before dawn, as the station prepared for the changing of shifts, the night officers took satisfaction in the knowledge that their careful work during the peaceful, overnight hours had contributed to the ongoing effort to maintain community safety and support the administration of justice. Their patient attention to detail and commitment to thorough documentation ensured that the department's response to crime was both professional and effective, providing the foundation for successful prosecutions and ongoing crime prevention efforts. Asterisk. Detective Margaret Walsh had spent the better part of 3 decades working with crime scene photographs, but it was only in recent years, as she transitioned into the department's cold case unit, that she had begun to truly appreciate the strange alchemy that transformed urgent evidence into historical artifact. The photography lab in the basement of Central Station housed thousands of images that had been captured during the peak moments of criminal investigations, each one preserving a fragment of time when the outcome of a case hung in the balance. The filing system for photographic evidence had evolved over the decades, creating layers of organization that reflected changing technologies and investigative approaches. The oldest photographs, dating back to the 1950s, were stored in large envelopes that had yellowed with age, their black and white images capturing crime scenes with the formal composition and careful lighting that characterized police photography of that era. Walsh often found herself studying these older images not for investigative purposes but for the glimpses they provided into the Tulke city as it had existed decades earlier. A photograph taken during a 1954 burglary investigation showed not only the broken window that had provided entry to the perpetrator, but also the street beyond, lined with cars whose rounded curves and chrome details spoke of an era when the neighborhood had been younger and more prosperous. That the victims in these old photographs appeared in clothing and hairstyles that marked them as inhabitants of a different world, yet their expressions of shock, loss, and violation remained immediately recognizable across the decades. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, photographed in her living room after a break-in had scattered her belongings across the floor, wore the same expression of bewildered invasion that Detective Walsh had seen on the faces of countless crime victims. Throughout her career, the burglary at the Patterson home had been documented with the methodical thoroughness that characterized police work of the 1950s, with photographs showing the crime scene from multiple angles and careful attention to details that might provide clues about the perpetrator's methods and identity. The broken lock on the back door had been photographed in close-up, revealing the tool marks that would eventually lead investigators to a crowbar found in the possession of a local teenager who had been burglarizing homes to fund a gambling habit. Detective Walsh had access to the complete case file for the Patterson burglary, allowing her to trace the investigation from the initial crime scene, photographs through the arrest and prosecution of 17-year-old Robert Morrison, whose poor judgment had led him into a pattern of property crimes that had terrorized the neighborhood for several weeks. The resolution of the case had been documented with photographs of the recovered stolen goods, neatly arranged on tables in the police station's evidence room, the evidence room of the 1950s, as captured in these archival photographs, had been smaller and simpler than modern facilities, with wooden shelves and handwritten labels that gave it the appearance of a library or museum more than a law enforcement facility. Each piece of evidence had been carefully cataloged and photographed, creating permanent records that would be available for court proceedings and appeals processes that might extend for years after the original investigations. Moving forward through the decades, Detective Walsh could observe the gradual evolution of both photographic technology and investigative techniques. The 1960s had brought more sophisticated camera equipment and faster film that allowed for better documentation of crime scenes under difficult lighting conditions. The photographs from this era showed greater detail and clarity, capturing evidence that might have been missed or poorly documented with earlier technology. A series of photographs from a 1967 armed robbery investigation demonstrated the improved capabilities of police photography during this period. The crime scene at Morrison's Corner Store had been thoroughly documented, with images showing the position of cash register drawers that had been forced open, the scattered merchandise that indicated the robbers' hasty search for valuables, and the footprints preserved in spilled flour that would eventually help identify the perpetrator. The investigation of the Morrison's Corner Store robbery had involved Detective Lieutenant James Chun, whose patient approach to evidence analysis had been characteristic of police work during that era. The photograph showed how he had systematically documented every aspect of the crime scene, creating a comprehensive visual record that supported the methodical investigation that eventually led to the arrest of Thomas Anderson, a 23-year-old man whose desperation to pay gambling debts had driven him to increasingly desperate criminal acts. Detective Walsh found the photographs of Thomas Anderson particularly moving, showing a young man whose life had been derailed by poor decisions and addiction to gambling that had consumed his factory wages and led him to seek money through increasingly dangerous criminal activities. The booking photograph showed someone who appeared more defeated than defiant, his expression suggesting an understanding that his choices had led him to a point from which recovery would be difficult. The case file for the Morrison's Corner Store robbery included follow-up photographs taken months later, showing Thomas Anderson participating in a work release program that had allowed him to maintain employment while serving his sentence. These later photographs captured a different person, someone who had used his time in custody to address his gambling addiction and develop job skills that would support legitimate employment. After his release, the 1970s had brought color photography to police documentation, adding new dimensions to crime scene investigation that revealed details that had been obscured in black and white images. A series of photographs from a 1973 vandalism case showed the bright red spray paint that had been used to deface the walls of Lincoln Elementary School, the vivid color providing evidence about the specific materials used and potentially connecting the crime to other incidents involving similar paint. The vandalism at Lincoln Elementary had been investigated by Officer Maria Rodriguez, whose community-oriented approach had eventually revealed that the property damage was the work of several teenage students who had been expressing frustration with school policies they considered unfair. Rather than simply pursuing criminal charges, Officer Rodriguez had worked with school administrators and the students' families to develop alternative responses that addressed both the property damage and the underlying concerns that had motivated the vandalism. The photographs documenting the resolution of the Lincoln Elementary case showed the same walls that had been defaced, now cleaned and repainted by the students who had caused the damage. Additional photographs captured a community meeting where the students had presented their concerns about school policies to administrators and parents, leading to changes that addressed some of their legitimate grievances. while also establishing clear consequences for future property damage. Detective Walsh appreciated these older cases for their comprehensive documentation of not only the crimes themselves, but also their resolution and long-term outcomes. Modern case files rarely included the kind of follow-up photography that showed how criminal cases had been resolved and what impact those resolutions had on the individuals and communities involved. The 1980s had brought advances in forensic photography that allowed for detailed documentation of fingerprints, tool marks, and other trace evidence that could prove crucial to identifying perpetrators and securing convictions. A case from 1984 involving a series of home invasions had been solved, largely through photographic evidence that captured distinctive shoe prints left at multiple crime scenes. The home invasion investigation had been conducted by Detective Frank Morrison, whose methodical approach to evidence collection had created a comprehensive photographic record that documented patterns connecting seemingly unrelated crimes throughout the Riverside district. The photographs showed how the perpetrator had used similar methods to gain entry to homes, always working during afternoon hours when residents were likely to be at work or school. The shoe print evidence that had eventually solved the case was documented in a series of photographs that showed not only the distinctive tread pattern but also wear characteristics that made it possible to identify the specific pair of shoes that had created the impressions. When suspect David Patterson was arrested for an unrelated offense, the shoes he was wearing matched the photographic evidence from the home invasion scenes, leading to charges that resulted in his conviction for multiple burglaries. Detective Walsh found the David Patterson case particularly interesting because the photographic evidence had been preserved so carefully that it remained useful decades later when she had reviewed the case as part of a research project examining the effectiveness of forensic photography in property crime investigations. The quality of the evidence photography had allowed for detailed analysis that would not have been possible with less comprehensive documentation. The 1990s had brought digital photography to police work, revolutionizing the speed and efficiency with which crime scenes could be documented, while also creating new challenges for evidence preservation and court presentation. Detective Walsh had been among the first officers in the department to transition from film to digital photography, requiring her to learn new technologies while maintaining the same standards of thoroughness and accuracy that had characterized her work with traditional photography. The transition to digital photography had coincided with Detective Walsh's assignment to the Domestic Violence Unit, where photographic documentation of injuries and property damage played a crucial role in prosecuting cases that often involved victims who were reluctant to testify against their abusers. The ability to immediately review and reshoot digital photographs had improved the quality of evidence documentation, while also reducing the time required to process and analyze photographic evidence. A domestic violence case from 1995 had demonstrated both the advantages and challenges of digital photography in police work. The ability to immediately view and evaluate photographs of victim injuries had allowed Detective Walsh to ensure that all evidence was properly documented during the initial investigation. But the case had also raised questions about the security and authenticity of digital images that could potentially be altered or manipulated. The victim in the 1995 case, Sandra Martinez, had initially been reluctant to cooperate with prosecution efforts. But the comprehensive photographic documentation of her injuries and the damage to her apartment had provided evidence that allowed prosecutors to proceed even without her direct testimony. The photographs had captured not only obvious injuries, but also subtle evidence of strangulation and defensive wounds that testified to the severity of the assault she had endured. Detective Walsh had worked closely with Sandra Martinez over several months, helping her access support services and safety planning resources, while also maintaining the photographic evidence that would be necessary if she eventually decided to participate in prosecution proceedings. The patient approach had eventually resulted in Sandra's cooperation with the prosecution that led to her abuser's conviction and her own successful transition to independent living with ongoing support services. The photographic archive that Detective Walsh maintained included not only crime scene and evidence images, but also documentation of community policing, initiatives and crime prevention programs that had been implemented throughout her career. These photographs captured police officers working with community groups, participating in neighborhood events, and building relationships that had proven crucial to effective law enforcement and crime prevention. A series of photographs from a 1992 community policing initiative showed officers working with residents to organize a neighborhood watch program that had successfully reduced property crimes in the Elmwood district. The images captured both formal training sessions and informal community gatherings where residents and police officers had developed the relationships and communication systems that made effective crime prevention possible. Detective Walsh had observed that these community policing photographs often captured moments of genuine connection between police officers and community members, showing the human relationships that formed the foundation of effective law enforcement. The images documented not only official programs and training sessions, but also the casual interactions and ongoing communication that built trust and cooperation between police and the communities they served. The evolution of crime scene photography over the decades had paralleled broader changes in law enforcement, with improved technology enabling more sophisticated investigation techniques while also reflecting changing approaches to community policing and crime prevention. Detective Walsh's archive represented not only the technical advancement of police photography, but also the human stories of crime, investigation, and resolution that had shaped the city's relationship with law enforcement over several decades. As she organized and digitized the older photographs for preservation and future reference, Detective Walsh reflected on the ways that these images captured not only specific criminal incidents, but also broader patterns of social change and community development that had transformed the city over her career. The photographs were simultaneously evidence of past crimes and historical documents that preserved moments in the ongoing evolution of urban life and law enforcement practice. The quiet work of organizing and preserving these photographic records had become for Detective Walsh a form of meditation on the nature of police work and its relationship to the communities it served. Each photograph represented human stories of conflict and resolution, loss and recovery, individual choices and their consequences for broader community well-being. Urban historian Dr. Elizabeth Carter had spent 15 years walking the streets of the city, documenting the layers of history that accumulated in neighborhoods like sediment in a riverbed. Her research into the relationship between crime and place had led her to understand that buildings, streets, and public spaces retained traces of the human dramas that had unfolded within them, creating an informal archive of community memory that existed parallel to the official records maintained by law enforcement agencies. The corner of 5th and Maple, where she paused on this quiet evening, had been the site of Morrison's Corner Store, which had closed in 1987 after serving the neighborhood for more than 40 years. The building now housed a small coffee shop whose owners had preserved some of the original fixtures, including the heavy wooden counter, where 3 generations of the Morrison family had served customers and occasionally dealt with the minor crimes that touched most small businesses. Dr. Carter had interviewed longtime residents who remembered the armed robbery that had occurred at Morrison's in 1967, an incident that had shocked the tight-knit community and led to changes in how local businesses approached security and community cooperation. Mrs. Elena Rodriguez, who had been a young mother shopping at the store that afternoon, still recalled the calm way that Mr. Morrison had handed over the cash register contents to the nervous young man who had demanded money to pay gambling debts. The robbery had been resolved within days, not through sophisticated investigative techniques, but through the kind of community knowledge that characterized neighborhoods where residents paid attention to each other's welfare and circumstances. Several neighbors had recognized the description of the robber and had quietly informed police that Thomas Anderson, who lived 3 blocks away, had been acting strangely and spending money he shouldn't have had access to. The building that had housed Morrison's corner store retained no visible traces of the robbery, but Dr. Carter had learned that places held memories in ways that transcended their physical appearance. The coffee shop that now occupied the space had unknowingly become part of a continuing story of community gathering and mutual support that had characterized the corner for decades, even surviving the disruption of criminal activity that had temporarily threatened the safety and stability that residents valued. Moving west along Maple Street, Dr. Carter passed the house where the Chun family had lived during the 1960s, when a series of residential burglaries had led to the formation of the neighborhood's first organized crime prevention efforts. House had changed hands several times since the Chun family had moved to a larger home in the suburbs, but its current residents had unknowingly inherited the legacy of community cooperation that had been established in response to the security concerns of an earlier era. The burglaries that had affected the Chun family and their neighbors had been relatively minor in terms of property loss, but they had represented a significant challenge to the sense of safety and community trust that residents had taken for granted. The response had involved not only improved locks and security measures, but also the establishment of informal communication networks that had strengthened relationships between neighbors and created lasting bonds that continued to influence the character of the neighborhood. Dr. Carter had documented how the social capital created in response to those 1960s burglaries had continued to benefit the neighborhood through subsequent decades, as residents maintained habits of mutual awareness and cooperation that made their streets naturally more resistant to criminal activity. The houses themselves had changed, additions had been built, gardens had been redesigned, facades had been updated, but the underlying social infrastructure that had been created in response to crime had proven remarkably durable. The elementary school at the corner of Maple and 7th Street had been the site of vandalism incidents in the 1970s that had led to innovative approaches to youth engagement and crime prevention. The building had been expanded and modernized since then, but Dr. Carter could still identify the walls where teenage students had spray painted messages expressing frustration with school policies they considered unfair and disconnected from their real concerns and interests. The resolution of the school vandalism had involved not only repairing the property damage, but also creating new channels for student input into school governance and policy development. The current student council system, which gave teenagers meaningful roles in addressing school issues, had evolved from the community meetings that had been organized in response to the vandalism, demonstrating how criminal incidents could sometimes catalyze positive institutional changes that outlasted the original problems. Principal Jennifer Martinez, who had worked at the school for 8 years, was unaware of the specific history of the 1970s vandalism, but she had inherited administrative structures and community relationships that had been shaped by the school's experience of responding constructively to student frustration and antisocial behavior. The collaborative approach to student discipline and engagement that characterized the school's current culture had roots in lessons learned during that earlier crisis. The playground behind the school had been redesigned several times since the 1970s, but Dr. Carter could still identify the area where community volunteers had worked with the students who had caused the vandalism to create a garden that had served both as restitution for the property damage and as a positive outlet for teenage energy and creativity. The current playground equipment occupied the same space, serving the same function of providing constructive activities for young people, while also strengthening connections between the school and surrounding neighborhood. The bridge over Miller Creek, which Dr. Carter crossed on her way to the Riverside District, had been the site of a suicide prevention intervention in 1983 that had led to the installation of emergency phones and the establishment of regular patrols by trained crisis counselors. The phones had been updated with newer technology over the years, but they remained as monuments to the community's commitment to preventing the kind of tragedy that had initially prompted their installation, the crisis that had led to the bridges. Safety improvements had involved a teenager named Michael Rodriguez, whose family troubles and academic struggles had brought him to the point of considering suicide as the only solution to problems that seemed overwhelming and permanent. The intervention by Officer Patricia Williams, who had been driving across the bridge during her regular patrol, had not only saved Michael's life, but had also led to the development of comprehensive youth crisis services that had helped dozens of other young people over the subsequent decades. Dr. Carter had interviewed Michael Rodriguez, now a social worker specializing in adolescent crisis intervention, about his memories of the incident and its long-term impact on his life and career choices. His experience on the bridge had taught him that moments of crisis were often also moments of opportunity, when appropriate intervention could redirect lives toward positive outcomes that would have been impossible without the catalyst of near tragedy. The Riverside District, which Dr. Carter entered after crossing the bridge, had been the setting for a series of home invasions during the 1980s that had been solved through patient police work and strong community cooperation. The neighborhood had responded to the crimes by strengthening social networks and communication systems that had made residents more aware of each other's routines and more likely to notice suspicious activities that might indicate criminal planning. Mrs. Sarah Patterson, who had lived in the same house on Elm Street for 35 years, remembered how the home invasions had initially created fear and suspicion that had threatened to undermine the community relationships that made the neighborhood a pleasant place to live. The police response, led by Detective Frank Morrison, had emphasized community education and cooperation rather than simply increasing enforcement, helping residents develop confidence in their ability to protect themselves and their neighbors. The house where the Patterson family lived had been one of the targets during the 1984 home invasion series, but the incident had been resolved quickly because neighbors had noticed unusual activity and had called police before any serious damage or loss had occurred. The experience had strengthened Mrs. Patterson's appreciation for the value of community cooperation and had led her to become an active participant in neighborhood organizations that continued to promote safety and mutual support. The vacant lot at the corner of Elm and 3rd Street had been the site of drug-dealing activities during the late 1980s that had been addressed through a community organizing campaign that had transformed the space into a small park where residents could gather for informal socializing and children could play safely. The park had required ongoing maintenance and attention from neighborhood volunteers, but it had successfully eliminated the isolated and neglected conditions that had made the lot attractive to criminal activity. Dr. Carter had documented the process through which residents had worked with city officials and police to reclaim the vacant lot, demonstrating how communities could address crime by changing the physical and social conditions that made criminal activity possible. The small park that now occupied the space featured playground equipment and benches that were maintained by an informal network of neighbors who had learned that preventing crime required ongoing community engagement rather than simply relying on law enforcement responses to problems after they had already developed. The apartment building on Pine Street, where Detective Rodriguez had investigated a domestic violence case in 1995, had been converted to condominiums, but Dr. Carter could identify the second-floor unit where Sandra Martinez had lived while working to escape an abusive relationship. The building's current residents were unaware of the specific history of domestic violence that had occurred there, but they had inherited a neighborhood culture that emphasized looking out for each other's welfare and providing support during personal crises. The domestic violence case had been resolved through a combination of criminal prosecution and social service intervention that had enabled Sandra Martinez to establish independent housing and employment while her abuser served time in prison. The success of the intervention had demonstrated the importance of coordinating law enforcement responses with comprehensive support services that address the underlying vulnerabilities that often made domestic violence situations chronic and dangerous. The community center on Oak Street had been established in the early 1990s as part of a crime prevention initiative that recognized the connection between youth engagement and community safety. The center had provided alternatives to street involvement for teenagers who might otherwise have been attracted to criminal activities, while also serving as a meeting place for residents who wanted to organize responses to neighborhood problems. Dr. Carter had studied the community center's history and impact, documenting how its programs had evolved over more than 2 decades to address changing community needs while maintaining a focus on crime prevention through positive youth development. The center's current programs included job training, educational support, and recreational activities that continued to serve the same function of providing constructive alternatives to criminal involvement. The success of the community center had been measured not only in the number of young people who participated in its programs, but also in the broader changes in neighborhood culture that had resulted from its presence. The center had become a focal point for community organizing and mutual support that had made the surrounding streets naturally more resistant to criminal activity while also improving the quality of life for all residents. Walking through the downtown area as evening settled over the city, Dr. Carter reflected on the ways that places retained memories of the human activities that had occurred within them. The buildings, streets, and public spaces that made up the urban landscape had been shaped by countless individual stories of crime and resolution, conflict and cooperation, fear and courage that had accumulated over decades of community life. The old courthouse, where she had begun her research into the relationship between crime and place, stood at the center of the downtown area as a physical reminder of society's ongoing commitment to resolving conflicts through peaceful means rather than violence or revenge. The building had witnessed thousands of cases over its 80-year history, each one representing an attempt to balance individual accountability with community healing and social justice. The streets around the courthouse had been the setting for many of the crimes that had been adjudicated within its walls, creating a geographic concentration of both criminal activity and legal resolution that had influenced the character and development of the surrounding neighborhood. The area had evolved over the decades from a primarily commercial district to a mixed-use neighborhood that included residential, business, and cultural activities that had created natural surveillance and community engagement. Dr. Carter's research had revealed that neighborhoods with strong social networks and active community engagement were naturally more resistant to criminal activity, while areas that lacked these characteristics often experienced higher crime rates regardless of their economic status or physical design. The presence of crime in a neighborhood was less important than the community's capacity to respond effectively and to maintain the social bonds that made residents feel safe and connected to each other. The city's transformation into an archive of its own memory had occurred gradually, through the accumulation of countless individual stories and community responses that had shaped the character of different neighborhoods and districts. Each street corner, building, and public space held traces of the human dramas that had unfolded there, creating an informal historical record that existed in the memories of longtime residents and the physical legacy of community responses to shared challenges. As Dr. Carter concluded her evening walk and returned to her office to document her observations, she reflected on the resilience and adaptability that communities had demonstrated in response to criminal activity throughout the city's history. The stories embedded in the urban landscape testified to the human capacity for learning, growth, and positive change that had enabled neighborhoods to overcome temporary setbacks and to build stronger, safer communities that could provide good lives for their residents. The quiet streets that surrounded her office building held within them the accumulated wisdom of decades of community experience. The lessons learned through trial and error about how to create and maintain neighborhoods where people could live safely and peacefully together. This informal archive of community memory represented a valuable resource for understanding how cities could continue to evolve in ways that promoted both individual opportunity and collective. Well-being. Chief Archivist Robert Chun stood in the deepest vault of the Central Records Division, surrounded by filing cabinets that stretched from floor to ceiling, each one containing the final resting place of cases that had been closed, resolved, and sealed into the permanent memory of the department. After 32 years of service, he had reached the end of his career, and his final duty was to ensure that the vast collection of documented human experience would be properly preserved for future generations who might need to understand how their community had wrestled with the eternal challenges of crime, justice, and social harmony. The process of sealing and archiving completed cases required a particular kind of reverence, an understanding that each file represented not just administrative paperwork, but the resolution of human conflicts that had disrupted lives and challenged community bonds. Chun moved slowly through the rows of cabinets, checking the organization and preservation status of thousands of cases that had been deemed closed, their stories complete, their lessons learned and filed away in the permanent archives. Case number 671142. The Morrison Corner Store robbery that had been solved through community cooperation and patient police work rested in drawer C23. Its manila folder containing Detective Lieutenant Chun's methodical investigation reports, witness statements, and the final documentation of Thomas Anderson's rehabilitation and successful reintegration into community life. The case had been sealed in 1970, 3 years after the initial incident, when Anderson had completed his community service and demonstrated sustained employment and responsible behavior. The file contained a letter from Mr. Morrison himself, written 5 years after the robbery, noting that Thomas Anderson had become a regular customer at the store and had developed into a trusted member of the neighborhood community. The letter had been included in the permanent record as testimony to the effectiveness of rehabilitation-focused approaches to criminal justice, demonstrating how even serious crimes could be resolved in ways that strengthened rather than damaged community bonds. Adjacent to the Morrison case, Chun found the files documenting the 1960s residential burglaries that had led to the first organized neighborhood watch programs in the Riverside district. The comprehensive documentation included not only the original crime reports and investigation records, but also follow-up studies that had tracked the long-term effectiveness of community-based crime prevention initiatives over subsequent decades. The burglary cases had been formally closed in 1968 when Tommy Morrison, the teenager who had been taking items to furnish his fort in the woods, had completed his community service and demonstrated changed behavior. But the case files also contained documentation of the lasting community improvements that had resulted from residents' response to the original crimes, including stronger neighborhood communication networks and increased social cohesion that had made the area naturally more resistant to future criminal activity. Dr. Elizabeth Carter's research into the neighborhood's evolution had been included in the permanent archive, providing future researchers with comprehensive documentation of how criminal incidents could catalyze positive community development when residents and law enforcement agencies worked together to address underlying causes rather than simply punishing criminal behavior. The academic study had elevated the simple burglary cases into examples of effective community policing that had influenced policy development throughout the region. Moving to a different section of the archives, Chun reviewed the domestic violence cases that had been resolved through Detective Williams's patient work with families struggling with complex problems that extended beyond simple law enforcement responses. The cases had been sealed with particular attention to privacy concerns, ensuring that victims and their families were protected from future exposure, while also preserving the procedural knowledge that had made successful interventions possible. The file for the Morrison family domestic violence case, closed in 1969 after David Morrison had completed alcohol treatment and anger management programs, contained follow-up documentation spanning 5 years after the initial intervention. The record showed how Officer Chun's patient approach had not only resolved the immediate crisis but had also connected the family with ongoing support services that had prevented recurrence and strengthened family relationships. The permanent archive included letters from Mary Morrison, written years after the crisis had been resolved, expressing gratitude for the patient and respectful way that her family's problems had been addressed. Her correspondence described how the intervention had not only ended the violence but had also provided her husband with tools for managing stress and anger that had improved their marriage and created a safer environment for their children. These letters represented the kind of long-term follow-up that had characterized police work in earlier eras, when officers maintained relationships with community members that extended beyond the resolution of immediate crises. The correspondence had been preserved as evidence of the effectiveness of comprehensive approaches to domestic violence that combined law enforcement with social service intervention and ongoing community support. The juvenile delinquency cases from the 1950s occupied their own section of the permanent archives, with files that documented Sergeant Murphy's innovative approaches to redirecting teenage energy toward constructive community involvement. The cases had been sealed after the young people involved had demonstrated sustained, positive behavior and successful transition into adult roles within the community. The file for the teenage vandalism case that had been resolved through community service work contained photographs of the completed community improvement projects, showing how the boys who had been causing property damage had channeled their energy into activities that had beautified the neighborhood and provided them with valuable job skills. The permanent record included employment records showing that several of the teenagers had gone on to successful careers in construction and other trades, largely as a result of the mentorship and training they had received through the community service program. Sergeant Murphy's final report on the juvenile cases had emphasized the importance of understanding that antisocial behavior among young people was often a symptom of their need for meaningful adult guidance and constructive outlets for their energy and ambition. His documentation had influenced the development of youth programs throughout the city, creating lasting institutional changes that had benefited thousands of young people over subsequent decades. The missing person cases occupied a special section of the archives, with files that documented not only the successful location of missing individuals but also the family reunification and support services that had addressed the underlying issues that had motivated people to disappear from their normal lives. Detective Reynolds's patient work with Mrs. Hoffman, the elderly woman who had suffered a stroke while traveling to reconcile with her estranged brother, had been preserved as an example of the thorough and compassionate approach that had characterized missing person investigations. Mrs. Hoffman's file contained correspondence documenting her successful reunion with her brother and the family, relationships that had been restored through Detective Reynolds's patient work. The case had been closed with documentation showing that Mrs. Hoffman had lived independently for several more years before moving to assisted living. where she had maintained active correspondence with the police department and had often spoken about the kindness that had been shown to her during her crisis. The permanent archives also contained the comprehensive documentation of community policing initiatives that had transformed approaches to crime prevention throughout the city. The neighborhood watch programs, community organizing projects, and youth engagement activities that had grown out of responses to specific criminal incidents had been documented with the same thoroughness that characterized individual case files. Mrs. Vasquez's work organizing the Maple Street neighborhood response to the 1985 burglaries had been preserved in a comprehensive file that included not only the original crime reports but also detailed documentation of the community development activities that had emerged from residents, determination to address the underlying social conditions that made their neighborhood vulnerable to criminal activity. The Maple Street file contained annual reports documenting the sustained reduction in property crimes that had resulted from increased community cohesion and the informal support networks that had been established to help struggling families before their problems escalated to the point where law enforcement intervention became necessary. The long-term success of the neighborhood organizing effort had been recognized as a model for community-based crime prevention that had been replicated in other areas throughout the city. The night shift operations that had provided the steady foundation for continuous law enforcement services had been documented in files that captured the essential but often invisible work of maintaining security and order during the hours when most citizens slept peacefully in their homes. Sergeant Santos's supervision of overnight operations had been preserved in comprehensive records that showed how patient administrative work and careful documentation had supported the more visible aspects of police work. The night shift files contained documentation of the quiet heroism that had characterized officers who had chosen to work during hours that allowed for thorough investigation and comprehensive case preparation. The work of Detective Rodriguez, Officer Park, and their colleagues had been preserved as examples of the dedication and professionalism that had made effective law enforcement possible, even during the quietest hours of community life. The photographic archives that Detective Walsh had organized and preserved represented a visual history of the city's encounter with crime and its evolution toward more effective and humane approaches to law enforcement. The thousands of images that had been carefully cataloged and stored would provide future researchers with comprehensive documentation of how investigative techniques, community relationships, and criminal justice approaches had evolved over several decades. The photographs had been organized not only by case number and date, but also by subject matter, creating cross-references that would allow future users to study patterns and trends in criminal activity, law enforcement responses, and community development initiatives. Detective Walsh's work had transformed the photographic evidence into a comprehensive research resource that would benefit academic researchers, policy developers, and law enforcement professionals for generations to come. Dr. Carter's research into the relationship between crime and place had been incorporated into the permanent archives as documentation of how communities had learned to transform the legacy of criminal activity into opportunities for positive development and increased social cohesion. Her work had provided academic validation for the community-based approaches to crime prevention that had been developed through practical experience by officers and residents working together to address shared challenges. The urban history research had been preserved alongside the case files and operational records, creating a comprehensive archive that documented not only individual crimes and their resolution, but also the broader social and economic factors that had influenced patterns of criminal activity and community response. The academic perspective had added depth and context to the official records, creating a more complete understanding of how law enforcement and community development had evolved together. As Chief Archivist Chun completed his final inventory of the permanent archives, he reflected on the vast collection of human stories that surrounded him in the quiet vault. Each sealed case represented the resolution of conflicts that had once threatened community peace and individual well-being. But more importantly, each file contained lessons about the capacity for healing, growth, and positive change that had characterized the city's approach to criminal justice. The archives represented more than just the endpoint of individual cases. They were the repository of institutional memory that would guide future approaches to law enforcement and community development. The wisdom contained in these files had been earned through decades of patient work by officers, community members, and officials who had understood that effective responses to crime required understanding, compassion, and commitment to addressing underlying causes rather than simply punishing criminal behavior. The silence that filled the archives was not the silence of endings, but the piece of stories that had found their proper resolution. Each case had been brought to closure through processes that had honored the dignity of all participants while also protecting community safety and promoting social justice. The files rested in their permanent storage, not as monuments to past problems, but as testimonies to the human capacity for learning, forgiveness, and positive change. In the deepest quiet of the archives, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of decades of community experience, Chun felt the satisfaction that came from knowing that important work had been completed and properly preserved. The stories contained in these files would continue to teach and inspire future generations who would face their own challenges in maintaining community safety and social harmony. The final entries in the archive logs documented not only the completion of individual cases, but also the ongoing evolution of approaches to criminal justice that had made the community stronger, safer, and more compassionate. The archived cases represented the foundation upon which future improvements would be built, the accumulated knowledge that would guide continuing efforts to create communities where all residents could live safely and peacefully together. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the small windows of the vault, Chief Archivist Chun secured the final filing cabinet and turned off the lights, leaving the archives to their eternal rest. The stories contained within those silent drawers would continue their work even in darkness, providing guidance and inspiration for future generations who would carry forward the ongoing human project of creating just and peaceful communities. The rhythm of silence that filled the archives was the heartbeat of institutional memory, the steady pulse of accumulated wisdom that would continue to influence approaches to law enforcement and community development long after the individual cases had been forgotten by all except the carefully maintained records that preserved their lessons for posterity. In the gathering dawn, the archives settled into their deepest peace, where all stories had found their proper ending, and all conflicts had discovered their resolution in the patient work of human beings committed to justice, understanding, and the endless possibility of redemption. The quiet that surrounded the sealed cases was not the silence of death, but the rest of stories that had fulfilled their purpose, and could now sleep peacefully in the knowledge that their lessons would continue to guide and inspire those who came after. The city above began to stir with the activities of a new day, but in the archives below, the documented memory of past struggles and their resolution rested in perfect stillness, providing the foundation of experience and wisdom upon which the continuing work of community building and social justice would always depend. In that final silence, all stories found their peace, and all cases discovered their eternal rest in the ordered calm of preserved memory. In the sub-basement, beneath the Central Records Division, behind a door that most current employees had never noticed, lay the original archives of the city's law enforcement efforts. Custodian Walter Morrison, the last person with keys to this forgotten space, made his final visit before retirement, carrying a small flashlight to illuminate rooms that had been sealed. Since the building's renovation in 1987, the air here carried the weight of nearly a century, thick with the accumulated silence of cases so old that their participants had long since passed into memory themselves. These were not the organized files of the modern archives above, but the original handwritten records from the city's earliest police department, when law enforcement consisted of a handful of officers who knew every resident by name and handled crimes with the informal authority of community elders. The first cabinet Walter opened contained incident reports from 1923, written in the careful script of Chief Patrick O'Sullivan, whose approach to police work had emphasized understanding the web of relationships and circumstances that connected all residents of what was then still a small town. The paper had yellowed to the color of old cream, and the ink had faded to a soft brown that required careful examination to decipher. Case number 23001 documented the theft of Mrs. Catherine Murphy's prize rooster, an incident that had threatened to disrupt the town's annual harvest festival when suspicion fell on her neighbor, Thomas Chen, whose own chickens had been producing fewer eggs than expected. Chief O'Sullivan's investigation had revealed that the rooster had simply wandered off during a storm and had been living wild in the woods behind the Murphy property. The resolution of the case had required not only locating the missing rooster, but also mediating the neighborly tensions that had developed during the investigation. Chief O'Sullivan's final report described a community meeting where both families had acknowledged their hasty assumptions and had worked together to build better fencing that would prevent future incidents. The case file contained a photograph of the Harvest Festival, showing Mrs. Murphy and Mr. Chun working side by side at the community barbecue. Walter found something deeply moving about these earliest records, which documented a time when the boundary between law enforcement and community mediation had been so fluid that resolving crimes often meant strengthening relationships rather than simply determining guilt and punishment. The handwritten reports read more like family stories than official police documentation, filled with details about personal backgrounds, family histories, and community dynamics that provided context for understanding why conflicts had developed and how they could be resolved. Case number 23008 involved what Chief O'Sullivan had described as the Great Pie controversy, when accusations of recipe theft had threatened to split the women's auxiliary of the Methodist Church. Mrs. Sarah Patterson had accused Mrs. Elena Rodriguez of stealing her grandmother's apple pie recipe, which had won the county fair 3 years running before Mrs. Rodriguez had begun entering suspiciously similar pies in the same competition. The investigation had required Chief O'Sullivan to interview both women, their family members, and several church ladies who had witnessed the exchanges of recipes and cooking advice that were common at church gatherings. His patient questioning had revealed that both women had learned their techniques from the same elderly German immigrant, Mrs. Bertha Schmidt, who had taught pie making to anyone willing to learn during the difficult years following World War I. The resolution had brought both women together with Mrs. Schmidt, now in her 80s, who had explained that she had indeed taught the same basic recipe to dozens of local women, encouraging each one to add their own variations and improvements. The case had concluded with the establishment of a new category in the county fair for traditional German-style apple pies, allowing both women to compete while honoring the immigrant heritage that had enriched the community's culinary traditions. Moving deeper into the forgotten archives, Walter discovered files from the 1930s, when the economic hardships of the Depression had created new types of crimes that reflected the desperation of families struggling to maintain their dignity while meeting basic needs. The cases from this era showed how law enforcement had adapted to address problems that arose from social conditions rather than individual moral failings. Case number 34012 documented the investigation into a series of thefts from the church food pantry, where someone had been taking provisions that were intended for families who had lost jobs or farms during the economic collapse. Detective James Morrison, Chief O'Sullivan's son, who had joined the force after returning from college, had approached the case with the understanding that whoever was taking the food was likely someone who desperately needed help but was too proud to ask for assistance. Through official channels, the investigation had revealed that the thief was 16-year-old Michael Rodriguez, whose father had lost his job at the grain elevator and whose mother had been too embarrassed to admit to their church friends that the family was struggling to buy food. Rather than prosecuting the teenager, Detective Morrison had worked with church leaders to create a more discreet system for providing assistance to families who needed help but were reluctant to ask for it publicly. The case file contained letters from several families who had benefited from the improved assistance system, expressing gratitude for the sensitive way their situations had been handled and for the ongoing support that had helped them maintain their dignity during temporary hardships. The church food pantry had evolved into a comprehensive community support program that had helped dozens of families survive the worst years of the Depression. Walter noticed that these Depression-era cases consistently showed law enforcement officers working as community organizers and social workers, roles that had been necessary when other support systems had been overwhelmed by the scope of economic hardship. The police had become the institution that connected struggling families with resources and opportunities, often preventing crime by addressing the underlying conditions that made illegal activity seem like the only viable option. Case number 36019 involved what the reports described as the unemployment riots, when tensions between local workers and migrants seeking farm work had escalated into street confrontations that had threatened to tear the community apart. Chief Morrison had responded, not with mass arrests but with the organization of community meetings where both groups could voice their concerns and work toward solutions that addressed everyone's legitimate needs. The resolution had required weeks of patient mediation, with Chief Morrison serving as a neutral facilitator who helped residents understand that their common interests in community stability and economic recovery were more important than the differences that had initially seemed irreconcilable. The case file documented the establishment of a job-sharing program that had provided work for both local residents and migrants while also creating the labor force necessary for local farms to remain productive during difficult economic times. The 1940s files, marked by the disruptions and changes brought by World War II, showed how law enforcement had adapted to serve a community where many young men were away in military service and where women had taken on roles that had previously been restricted to men. The cases from this era reflected the social tensions and adjustments that had been necessary as traditional patterns of community life had been disrupted by the demands of wartime. Case number 43007 documented the investigation into black market activities that had developed around ration goods, particularly gasoline and sugar, that were being sold illegally to residents who had used up their official rations. Detective Patricia Williams, one of the first women to serve in law enforcement in the city, had approached the case with understanding of the family pressures that had motivated otherwise law-abiding citizens to participate in illegal commerce. The investigation had revealed a complex network of residents who had been trading rationed goods based on their individual family needs, with some households that included diabetics trading their sugar rations for extra gasoline. from families who preferred to walk rather than drive. Detective Williams had worked with federal rationing officials to create a legal exchange system that allowed residents to trade their rations according to their actual needs, rather than forcing everyone to accept standardized allocations. The case had been resolved without prosecutions, but it had led to policy changes that had made the rationing system more flexible and responsive to individual family circumstances. Detective Williams's report had been forwarded to federal authorities as an example of how local communities could adapt wartime regulations to serve local needs, while still supporting the overall war effort. Walter found the 1950s files particularly interesting because they documented the community's transition from wartime disruption back to peacetime patterns, a process that had created new types of social tensions as veterans returned home and families readjusted to normal civilian life. The cases from this era showed how law enforcement had helped facilitate these transitions through patient work with individuals and families who were struggling to adapt to changing circumstances. Case number 52015 involved domestic disturbances in several families, where veterans were having difficulty readjusting to civilian life and family responsibilities after years of military service. Officer Robert Chun, who had himself served in the Pacific Theater, had developed specialized approaches to working with veterans whose wartime experiences had left them struggling with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The cases had been resolved through a combination of individual counseling, family mediation, and the establishment of veteran support groups that had provided ongoing assistance for men who were having difficulty transitioning back to peacetime life. Officer Chun's work had prevented several domestic violence situations from escalating, while also helping families understand and address the psychological impacts of military service. The success of the Veteran Support Program had led to its expansion into a comprehensive community mental health initiative that had provided services for residents dealing with various types of psychological distress. The program had been among the first in the region to recognize that mental health issues were medical conditions that required treatment, rather than moral failings that required punishment. Moving into the 1960s files, Walter observed how law enforcement had begun to address the social changes that had characterized that turbulent decade, including civil rights activism, generational conflicts, and changing attitudes toward authority that had challenged traditional approaches to maintaining community order. The cases from this era showed officers adapting their methods to serve a more diverse and complex community. Case number 6321 documented the department's response to civil rights demonstrations that had occurred when the local lunch counter had refused to serve African American customers. Chief David Morrison had worked with community leaders from both the white and black communities to organize peaceful dialogue sessions that had addressed the underlying racial tensions while also ensuring that demonstrations remained nonviolent. The resolution had required months of patient negotiation, but it had resulted in the voluntary integration of local businesses without the violent confrontations that had occurred in other communities. Chief Morrison's approach had emphasized the shared interests that all residents had in maintaining community peace and economic prosperity, while also ensuring that all citizens could participate fully in community life. The final section of the Forgotten Archives contained files from the early 1970s, when the department had begun the transition toward more modern approaches to law enforcement, while still maintaining the community-oriented philosophy that had characterized its work for nearly 50 years. These cases showed how the lessons learned during decades of community policing had been preserved and adapted to serve changing social conditions. Walter's flashlight illuminated one final cabinet containing Chief Morrison's farewell report from 1974, when he had retired after 43 years of service. The report reflected on the evolution of law enforcement in the city, and emphasized the importance of maintaining the understanding that effective police work required not only technical skills but also deep knowledge of community dynamics and genuine commitment to serving all residents fairly and compassionately. Chief Morrison's final report included recommendations for future department leadership, emphasizing the need to preserve the institutional memory and community relationships that had made the department effective while also adapting to new challenges and opportunities that would emerge as the city continued to grow and change. His insights had been preserved in these forgotten archives, waiting to inform future generations of law enforcement professionals who might rediscover the wisdom contained in these earliest records. As Walter prepared to lock the forgotten archives for the final time, he reflected on the profound continuity that connected these earliest cases with the modern police work being conducted in the building above. The fundamental challenges of maintaining community order, resolving conflicts, and helping people live together peacefully had remained constant even as methods and technologies had evolved. The silence that filled these deepest archives was different from the organized quiet of the modern filing systems above. Here, in the original records of the city's law enforcement efforts, the stories rested in a peace so profound that it seemed to exist outside of time itself. These cases had found their resolution not only in their own era, but in the accumulated wisdom that had guided all subsequent police work in the community. Walter turned off his flashlight and secured the door, leaving the original archives to their eternal rest. The stories contained within those handwritten records would continue their quiet influence, providing the foundation of community memory upon which all future law enforcement efforts would build. In the perfect stillness of the forgotten chambers, the oldest cases waited in patient silence, their lessons preserved for rediscovery by those who would one day need their wisdom. The city above continued its modern rhythms, but in the deepest archives below, time moved differently, measured not in hours or days, but in the slow accumulation of understanding about how communities could learn to heal themselves through patient work, mutual respect, and the endless human capacity for growth and redemption. In that timeless quiet, all stories found their deepest peace, and all wisdom settled into its most perfect rest. Night Librarian Grace Patterson had worked in the city's main library for 17 years, but it was only recently that she had begun to notice the subtle connection between the police archives housed in the basement and the dreams that visitors seemed to carry away from their research sessions. The library had become an unofficial extension of the police department's historical records, a place where journalists, researchers, and curious citizens came to understand how their community had evolved through its encounters with crime and justice. The reading room on the library's third floor maintained a collection of oral histories, newspaper clippings, and community documents that provided civilian perspectives on the law enforcement cases that had shaped the city's development over the decades. Unlike the official police files with their emphasis on procedures and outcomes, these civilian records captured the emotional and social dimensions of how crimes had affected ordinary people's daily lives. Mrs. Elena Santos, now in her 80s, had recently donated her collection of neighborhood newsletters from the 1960s and 1970s, documents that provided month-by-month accounts of how residents had responded to the various criminal incidents that had occurred in their community. The newsletters revealed how official police reports translated into lived experience, showing how crimes that appeared as brief summaries in police files had created ripple effects that influenced community relationships for years afterward. Grace often worked late into the evening, organizing these civilian documents and creating cross-references that connected them to the official records maintained by the police department. The work required her to read countless personal accounts of how crime had touched individual lives, stories that filled in the human details that were necessarily absent from the formal investigative reports that focused on facts and procedures rather than Emotions and relationships. Mr. Thomas Chun, whose family had lived in the Riverside district since the 1940s, had provided detailed accounts of how neighborhood dynamics had changed following various criminal incidents over the decades. His stories revealed how the community had learned to balance the desire for safety with the understanding that effective crime prevention required maintaining social connections rather than retreating into isolation and suspicion. The Chun family's experience with the 1960s burglaries had been documented not only in police files but also in family letters, neighborhood meeting minutes, and local newspaper articles that had been preserved in the library's collection. These multiple perspectives on the same events revealed how crimes that seemed straightforward in police reports had actually involved complex social negotiations that had ultimately strengthened community bonds. Rather than weakening them, Grace had begun to notice patterns in how different types of crimes had affected community development over time. Property crimes had generally led to increased cooperation and communication between neighbors, while violent crimes had created more complex responses that balanced the need for safety with the desire to maintain the open and trusting atmosphere that made neighborhoods pleasant places to live. The library's collection included scrapbooks maintained by various community organizations, documents that showed how civic groups, churches, and neighborhood associations had responded to criminal incidents by organizing activities that strengthened social connections and provided positive alternatives to the conditions that often contributed to criminal behavior. These grassroots responses had been as important as official law enforcement efforts in creating the community safety that residents valued. Mrs. Sarah Rodriguez had maintained detailed scrapbooks documenting the community organizing efforts that had emerged from the Maple Street neighborhood's response to the 1980s burglaries. The scrapbooks contained photographs of block parties, meeting minutes from neighborhood watch organizations, and newsletters that had kept residents informed about local crime prevention activities and community development initiatives. The scrapbooks revealed how the initial fear and anger that had followed the burglaries had gradually transformed into increased social engagement and community pride as residents had worked together to address the underlying conditions that had made their neighborhood vulnerable to criminal activity. The documentation showed how effective crime prevention had required not only security measures but also social investments that had made the Casamameda community more resilient and cohesive. Grace had observed that the most successful responses to criminal incidents had consistently involved approaches that treated crime as a symptom of broader social issues rather than simply as individual moral failures that required punishment. The communities that had emerged stronger from their encounters with crime had been those that had used criminal incidents as opportunities to examine and improve their social institutions and support systems. Libraries' evening hours attracted researchers who were studying various aspects of criminal justice history, including graduate students writing dissertations, journalists investigating current policy debates, and community activists seeking to understand how past successes and failures could inform contemporary crime prevention efforts. Grace had become an informal consultant for these researchers, helping them navigate the complex relationships between official records and community documents. Dr. Michael Williams, a criminology professor at the State University, had been conducting research into the long-term effectiveness of community-based crime prevention programs, using the library's collection to trace the outcomes of various initiatives over periods of 20 or 30 years. His work had revealed that programs that had emphasized relationship building and social support had generally produced more lasting results than those that had focused primarily on surveillance, and enforcement. The professor's research had documented how the community organizing efforts that had emerged from responses to specific criminal incidents had often evolved into comprehensive neighborhood improvement initiatives that had addressed housing, employment, education, and social services in addition to public safety concerns. These holistic approaches had created communities that were naturally more resistant to criminal activity while also providing better quality of life for all residents. Grace had assisted Dr. Williams in locating follow-up documentation that showed how children who had grown up in neighborhoods with strong community crime prevention programs had been less likely to become involved in criminal activity themselves, suggesting that the benefits of effective crime prevention extended beyond immediate public safety improvements to include long-term social development outcomes. The library's collection also included personal journals and diaries that had been donated by families whose members had been involved in criminal incidents, either as victims, offenders, or community responders. These intimate documents provided insights into the emotional and psychological dimensions of crime and recovery that were rarely captured in official records or even in oral history. Interviews. The diary of Margaret Patterson, whose home had been burglarized in 1967, documented her gradual recovery from the sense of violation and vulnerability that had initially made her afraid to remain in her own house. The diary entries showed how participation in neighborhood organizing activities had helped her regain confidence and sense of control while also contributing to improvements that had benefited other residents. Margaret Patterson's diary had been particularly valuable for researchers studying the psychological impacts of property crime because it provided detailed, contemporaneous accounts of how her feelings and attitudes had changed over months and years following the initial incident. The diary showed how community support and engagement had been as important as improved security measures in helping her feel safe and confident in her home. The diary entries also revealed how Margaret Patterson's experience as a crime victim had motivated her to become involved in community activities that had provided support for other residents facing various challenges. Her volunteer work with elderly neighbors, participation in youth mentoring programs, and involvement in local political activities had all grown out of her understanding that individual safety depended on community well-being. Grace had noticed that many of the personal documents in the library's collection told similar stories of how people who had been affected by crime had channeled their experiences into positive community involvement that had benefited far more people than just themselves. These individual transformations had accumulated over time to create communities that were more caring, more engaged, and more effective at preventing problems before they escalated into crises. The library's evening reading room attracted individuals who were researching their own family histories, often discovering connections to criminal incidents that had occurred decades before their births, but had influenced the community development that had shaped their childhood environments. These genealogical researchers had contributed to the library's collection by donating family documents and photographs that provided additional perspectives on historical events. Jennifer Chen, researching her grandfather's immigration experience, had discovered that her family's successful integration into the community had been partly due to the support they had received from neighbors who had been involved in community organizing activities that had grown out of responses to 1940s crimes involving tensions between established residents and new immigrants. The family documents she had donated included letters describing how community mediation had resolved conflicts that could have escalated into lasting ethnic divisions. The Chen family documents had been particularly valuable because they provided immigrant Perspectives on community crime prevention efforts, showing how newcomers had been included in neighborhood activities and how their participation had strengthened both their own integration and the overall effectiveness of community safety initiatives. The letters revealed how diversity had been treated as an asset rather than a liability in communities that had learned to work together across cultural differences. As Grace organized and cataloged these various civilian perspectives on criminal justice history, she had begun to understand that the official police records represented only one layer of a much more complex story about how communities had learned to maintain safety, resolve conflicts, and support all residents in leading productive and peaceful lives. The civilian documents revealed the social infrastructure that had made effective law enforcement possible, while also showing how community responses to crime had created lasting improvements that had benefited subsequent generations. The reading room's atmosphere during evening hours was particularly conducive to the kind of reflective research that revealed connections and patterns that might not be visible during busier daytime periods. The quiet environment allowed researchers to spend hours immersed in historical documents, developing the deep familiarity with community history that was necessary for understanding how past experiences could inform contemporary challenges. Grace had observed that researchers who spent extended time with the historical documents often experienced what they described as a sense of connection with the people whose stories they were studying, feeling that they had come to understand not only what had happened, but also why particular approaches had been successful or unsuccessful in addressing community problems. This deep engagement with historical experience had often led to insights that influenced contemporary policy debates and community organizing efforts. The library's collection had become a resource for community leaders who were facing current challenges similar to those that had been addressed by previous generations, allowing them to learn from both the successes and failures of past approaches while adapting historical lessons to contemporary circumstances. Grace had facilitated meetings between current community organizers and longtime residents who had participated in earlier crime prevention initiatives, creating opportunities for direct knowledge transfer between generations. As the evening deepened and the reading room settled into its quietest hours, Grace reflected on the remarkable continuity that connected past and present efforts to create safe and caring communities. The documents surrounding her represented decades of human experience with the challenges of living together peacefully, providing a repository of wisdom that remained relevant despite changing social conditions and technologies. The stories contained in the library's collection would continue to inform and inspire future generations who would face their own versions of the eternal human challenges of maintaining justice, safety, and community well-being. In the gentle quiet of the evening reading room, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of generations of community members who had worked to create better lives for themselves and their neighbors, Grace felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing that important knowledge was being preserved and made available for those who would need its guidance. The boundary between documented history and living memory became permeable in these quiet hours, as the stories of past struggles and successes seemed to speak directly to contemporary challenges and opportunities. In this peaceful space where research became meditation and understanding became wisdom, all stories found their way into the continuing narrative of community development and human growth that would guide future generations in their own efforts to create safe, just, and caring communities.